You're walking down a quiet street at dusk. The sky is a deep indigo, streetlights flicker on one by one, and the hum of distant traffic blends with the soft crunch of your footsteps on gravel. A couple passes by, laughing. A shopkeeper waves. A billboard glows with soft colors, nothing unusual. But what if every detail around you, the music drifting from a cafe, the tone of that stranger's greeting, even the timing of the crosswalk signal, was subtly calibrated not to sell you a product, but to shape the way you think? To make you feel slightly more trusting, a little more tired, or perhaps more inclined to agree with the next person who speaks to you. You wouldn't notice. That's the point. This isn't a dystopian fantasy. It's a quiet reality woven into the fabric of human interaction, one that plays out in boardrooms, bedrooms, and within the silent corridors of your own mind. Welcome to the world of the Invisible Puppeteer. The Invisible Puppeteer doesn't wear a mask or issue commands. They don't need to. Their power lies in subtlety, in the pause before a sentence, in the tilt of a head, in the careful omission of a single fact. They are the unseen hand that shapes decisions without leaving fingerprints. You might call them a manipulator, but that word feels too harsh, too deliberate. This influence is often unconscious, embedded in the rhythm of relationships, in social norms, in the very architecture of communication. It's not always malicious. Sometimes it's a parent trying to guide a child, a leader inspiring a team, or a partner seeking reassurance. But the mechanism remains the same, an effort to steer behavior without overt control. And because it's so gentle, so seamless, it slips beneath the radar of awareness. You believe you're choosing freely, when in fact, your options have already been narrowed, your emotions gently primed, your instincts quietly redirected. Consider the chess player who never touches the board. They sit across from their opponent and say, "That's an interesting move," or "Are you sure you want to go there?" No commands, no interference, just observation and suggestion. Yet over time, the opponent begins to second-guess, to hesitate, to play not their own game, but one shaped by the quiet presence of the watcher. This is the essence of covert influence. It doesn't overpower, it infiltrates. It doesn't shout, it whispers. And because it feels so natural, so conversational, we rarely question it. We mistake suggestion for insight, pressure for preference, and manipulation for mutual understanding. History is full of invisible puppeteers. Machiavelli, in The Prince, wrote not of brute force, but of cunning, of how rulers could maintain power not through fear alone, but through perception, timing, and the strategic use of reputation. During the Cold War, both the CIA and KGB invested heavily in psychological operations, not to invade nations, but to shape beliefs, to plant doubts, to make entire populations question their own leaders. And today, in the age of big data and behavioral science, we've refined these techniques to an art. Companies use algorithms to predict what you'll want before you know it yourself. Politicians craft messages designed to trigger emotional responses buried deep in the subconscious. Social media platforms engineer engagement by exploiting dopamine loops, making you scroll longer, react faster, believe more readily, all without you realizing you're being guided. Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman, in his groundbreaking work on cognitive biases, revealed something profound. The human mind is not a rational machine, but a pattern-seeking, shortcut-taking organism. We rely on heuristics, mental shortcuts, that make us efficient, but also predictable. Once you understand those patterns, you can anticipate behavior. And once you can anticipate it, you can influence it. This is the foundation of modern manipulation. It's not about coercion, it's about designing environments, conversations, and emotional landscapes that make certain choices feel inevitable. A manager might frame a deadline as what the team is counting on, not as a demand. A partner might sigh and say, "I guess I'll manage on my own," instead of asking for help. These aren't lies. They're nudges. And they work because they align with our deepest needs: to belong, to be seen, to avoid conflict. But here lies the unsettling core of the invisible puppeteer, the erosion of free will. If your decisions can be shaped by tone, timing, and emotional context, if your sense of autonomy can be preserved while your choices are quietly steered, then what does it mean to be free? Are you the author of your life, or merely the narrator of a story written by others? The more you recognize these patterns, the more you begin to see them everywhere. In a friend's well-timed compliment before asking a favor. In a news headline designed to provoke outrage. In the way silence can be louder than words. And perhaps most disturbing of all, you start to see them in yourself. Because we are not just puppets. We are also puppeteers. We all use these techniques, often without realizing it, shaping conversations, managing perceptions, protecting our own needs. The line between influence and manipulation is not always clear. Sometimes, it's drawn only by intent. Other times, it's erased entirely by habit. So as we begin this journey through 27 mind games, remember this: awareness is not control. But it is the first step toward it. You cannot stop the strings from moving, but you can learn to feel them. And in that feeling, in that quiet recognition, there is space. Space to pause. To question. To choose. Now, let's look at one of the most common strings on the puppeteer's hand, a game so simple, yet so devastating. It begins with a whisper of doubt. You wake in the quiet of early morning, the house still wrapped in a soft, gray hush. As you reach for your keys, your hand brushes empty space. They're not where you remember leaving them, right there on the wooden table by the door, next to the coffee mug from last night. You're certain. You can almost see them, glinting under the dim kitchen light. But then she walks in, sipping tea, and says, "Again? You really need to start writing things down. You've been so forgetful lately." Her voice is calm, almost concerned. And just like that, a small crack forms in your certainty. Did you really put them there? Maybe you were tired. Maybe you're more stressed than you thought. Maybe you imagined it. This is not a simple misunderstanding. This is gaslighting, the slow, insidious erosion of your trust in your own mind. The term comes from the 1944 film Gaslight, in which a husband systematically manipulates his wife into believing she's losing her sanity. He dims the gaslights in their home, then insists she's imagining the flicker. He hides her belongings, only to later suggest she misplaced them. He whispers in another room, then denies speaking at all. Over time, she begins to question her memory, her senses, even her sanity. The horror of the film isn't in violence or rage, it's in the quiet dismantling of reality. And that's what makes gaslighting so uniquely devastating. It doesn't attack the body. It attacks the foundation of self, the belief that you can trust what you see, hear, and remember. At its core, gaslighting is not just lying. It's a form of psychological control that operates by destabilizing perception. The manipulator doesn't merely deny the truth, they reframe it. They don't say, "I took your keys." They say, "You must have left them somewhere else. You've been so distracted." The accusation is inverted. The victim, not the manipulator, becomes the source of the problem. And because the gaslighter often appears calm, rational, even caring, their version of events feels more credible. Who would believe you're being manipulated when the manipulator seems so reasonable? This works because the human mind is built for coherence. We cannot tolerate contradiction for long. When our experience clashes with someone we trust, especially someone close to us, our brain scrambles to resolve the dissonance. And more often than not, it does so by turning inward. It's easier to believe you're mistaken than to believe someone you love is deliberately distorting reality. So you begin to second guess. You replay memories, searching for flaws. You apologize for things you didn't do. You start keeping notes, recording conversations, taking photos, anything to prove to yourself that you're not losing your mind. But even the evidence feels fragile, because the gaslighter will always find a way to reinterpret it. You're overthinking again, they might say. You're so sensitive. And slowly, the ground beneath you turns to mist. What makes gaslighting so philosophically unsettling is that it exposes a deep vulnerability in human consciousness. Our reality is not private. It's social. We rely on others to confirm what's real. When a child points at the moon and says, "Look," and a parent responds, "Yes, there it is," that shared acknowledgement builds a shared world. But when that confirmation is weaponized, when the person you trust says, "There's nothing there," the world begins to unravel. Descartes once asked, "How do I know I'm not being deceived by an evil demon?" Gaslighting brings that question out of the abstract and into the bedroom, the kitchen, the quiet moments between lovers. It forces us to confront the terrifying possibility that our most basic experiences, what we saw, heard, felt, might not be trustworthy. And if you can't trust your senses, what's left of identity? If memory is unreliable, perception flawed, and judgment suspect, then who are you? In recent years, this personal form of manipulation has begun to echo on a cultural level. In an age of deepfakes, algorithmic misinformation, and political rhetoric that routinely dismisses facts as fake news, the line between truth and fiction is increasingly blurred. Leaders deny events captured on video. Institutions dispute data that contradicts their narrative. Entire populations are taught to distrust not just each other, but the very mechanisms of truth, science, journalism, memory. In this environment, gaslighting stops being just a tool of emotional abuse and becomes a strategy of power. And when gaslighting is normalized, when denial is routine, the collective sense of reality begins to fragment. We all start wondering, am I the one who's wrong? Yet the most haunting aspect of gaslighting may be how quietly it spreads. It doesn't announce itself. It grows in the spaces between words, in the tone of a sigh, in the careful placement of a doubt. It thrives in relationships where love and control are tangled, where care is used as a weapon. And because it feels so intimate, so personal, it's one of the hardest mind games to escape. Admitting you've been gaslit means admitting you were deceived by someone you trusted. It means confronting the possibility that your reality has been shaped not by truth, but by manipulation. But awareness is the first light in the dark. To recognize gaslighting is to begin reclaiming your mind. To say, "I saw what I saw," is an act of resistance. Now, let's turn to another subtle form of control, one that doesn't target your memory, but your heart. It begins not with doubt, but with guilt. There's a moment, quiet and almost imperceptible, when love begins to tighten around you like a slow coil. You're sitting at the kitchen table, sipping tea, when your mother sighs and says, "After all I've done for you, staying up with you when you were sick, working double shifts just to pay for your classes, you can't even come home for the holidays?" Her voice doesn't rise. There's no anger, no ultimatum. Just a soft, wounded tone, a flicker of sadness in her eyes. And yet, in that instant, something shifts inside you. A knot forms in your stomach. You start to justify, to explain, to promise, yes, maybe I can rearrange things, maybe I'll come after all. You haven't been threatened. You haven't been ordered. But you've been moved. This is the guilt trip, not a demand, but an emotional tax levied on love, loyalty, and memory. It's care weaponized, affection turned into obligation, and it's one of the most effective and invisible mind games ever played. At its core, the guilt trip operates by invoking a sense of debt. Not financial, but emotional. It reminds you of past sacrifices, unseen efforts, silent sufferings, real or exaggerated, and implies that your current actions, or inactions, are a betrayal of that investment. The manipulator doesn't say, "You must do this." They say, "I guess I'll manage without you," or "I just thought after everything, you'd want to be here." The message is clear: if you don't comply, you're not just refusing a request, you're rejecting their love, their effort, their very identity as someone who gave everything for you. And because guilt is deeply wired into our social survival, the pressure is almost unbearable. We evolved in tribes, where belonging meant safety, and exclusion meant death. To feel guilty was to recognize a breach in the social fabric, to sense that we had endangered our place in the group. That ancient alarm still rings in our nervous systems, even when the stakes are as small as skipping a family dinner. What makes the guilt trip so insidious is its camouflage. It rarely appears as manipulation. It wears the face of vulnerability, of love, of selflessness. The person deploying it may genuinely believe they're expressing hurt, not control. That's what makes it so hard to resist. You don't feel attacked, you feel needed. And in that need, you find purpose. But purpose with a price. Every time you give in, the debt is reinforced. The expectation grows. The silence between the words becomes louder. You owe me. You should know better. How could you forget what I've done? And so, over time, your choices are no longer guided by desire or reason, but by the weight of imagined betrayal. You attend the event you don't want to attend. You take the job you don't want. You stay in the relationship that drains you, not because you want to, but because saying no feels like moral failure. The deeper horror lies in the duality of it all. Often, the person laying the guilt trip truly loves you. They may have sacrificed greatly. Their pain may be real. And that's what makes the game so devastating. It's not always malicious. Sometimes, it's born from fear, fear of abandonment, fear of being unappreciated, fear of losing control over a relationship that means everything to them. This blurs the line between care and coercion. Is it love if it comes with strings? Can affection be pure if it demands repayment? And if every act of kindness is later used as currency, does generosity cease to exist? These are not just personal dilemmas, they are existential questions about the nature of human connection. We want to believe love is unconditional. But in practice, it often comes with silent contracts, unwritten clauses, emotional interest rates that compound over time. Worse still, the guilt trip teaches us to police ourselves. After a while, you don't even need the other person to speak. You hear their voice in your head before you make a decision. Would mom be disappointed? Would they feel abandoned? You start canceling plans, suppressing desires, reshaping your life to avoid the weight of their imagined sorrow. The manipulator doesn't need to say a word. The guilt has become internalized. You are now your own jailer, enforcing their expectations in the quiet of your conscience. And because the prison feels self-imposed, you can't even name it as oppression. You call it responsibility. You call it loyalty. You call it love. This dynamic isn't limited to personal relationships. It scales. Politicians invoke the sacrifices of soldiers to justify war. Advertisers show starving children to sell watches. Religious leaders speak of divine suffering to demand obedience. Think of the children. After all we've been through, don't you care? These are all variations of the same emotional leverage. The message is always the same. To say no is to be inhuman. To prioritize yourself is to betray the collective. And in a world that already teaches us to doubt our worth, the guilt trip finds fertile ground. But perhaps the most unsettling implication is this: if love can be used as a tool of control, then the very thing we seek for freedom, connection, belonging, affection, can also be the mechanism of our entrapment. And if we cannot distinguish between genuine care and emotional blackmail, then we risk spending our lives repaying debts we never agreed to. Yet awareness is the first step toward liberation. To recognize the guilt trip is not to reject love, but to demand that love be free. Now, let's turn to another form of silent control, one where the manipulator doesn't speak at all, but uses absence as their weapon. There is a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone, but from being ignored while someone sits just feet away. You're in the same room, perhaps sharing a meal, and yet it feels as though a wall has risen between you, transparent, impenetrable. No shouting. No accusations. Just silence. A turned head. Averted eyes. A response delayed until it's no longer a response at all. This is the silent treatment, not a lapse in communication, but a calculated withdrawal, a weapon wrapped in stillness. It masquerades as passivity, as hurt, as a need for space. But beneath its quiet surface lies an act of profound control, one that exploits the deepest threads of human attachment. We are not meant to exist in emotional isolation. From the moment we are born, our survival depends on connection. A baby's cry is answered by a parent's touch. A child learns identity through the mirror of another's gaze. As we grow, our sense of self is shaped by recognition, by knowing that we are seen, heard, acknowledged. To be ignored, then, is not merely an inconvenience. It is a threat. It echoes the primal fear of exile, of being cast out from the tribe, left to face the dark alone. The silent treatment taps directly into this ancient vulnerability. It doesn't punish with words, it punishes with absence. And in that absence, the mind races. What did I do? Should I speak first? Is this permanent? The silence becomes a void that demands to be filled, and the only currency accepted is submission. What makes this tactic so effective is its simplicity. No elaborate lies, no emotional theatrics, just the deliberate withholding of attention. The manipulator doesn't have to argue, defend, or even explain. They simply disappear, emotionally, while remaining physically present. And in that liminal space, where you are neither forgiven nor condemned, you begin to unravel. You replay the last conversation, searching for offense. You send tentative messages, offer small gestures, laugh a little too loudly at their silence, hoping to spark a reaction. You apologize, not because you believe you've done wrong, but because the silence is unbearable. It's not logic that drives you, it's the ache of disconnection. You will concede, retract, perform anything to restore the bond, to hear your name spoken again. This is the machinery of intermittent reinforcement, the same psychological principle that fuels gambling addiction. When rewards are unpredictable, when the slot machine sometimes pays out, you don't walk away. You keep playing, chasing the next win. In the same way, the silent treatment keeps its victim in a state of anxious anticipation. One day, the person may speak to you normally, as if nothing happened. The next, they retreat again. This inconsistency deepens the dependency. You never know when the silence will return, so you begin to walk on eggshells, adjusting your behavior to avoid triggering it. Over time, you start to orbit around their moods, shaping your words, your presence, your very self to maintain the fragile peace. Autonomy erodes not through force, but through fear of losing what little connection remains. And yet, the most paradoxical truth about the silent treatment is that it is not empty. It is full of meaning, full of pressure, full of unspoken judgment. In a world saturated with noise, silence becomes one of the loudest forms of communication. It speaks volumes. You are not worthy of my words. You have failed. You are outside the circle of care. It is a form of punishment that requires no effort, no confrontation, no accountability. The manipulator can claim innocence, "I didn't say anything," while wielding silence like a blade. And because it leaves no verbal record, it's nearly impossible to confront. How do you argue with nothing? How do you prove the harm of an absence? Philosophically, the silent treatment challenges our understanding of power. We assume dominance requires action, commands, aggression, overt control. But here, power resides in restraint. The one who can withhold the most affection, acknowledgement, presence, holds the upper hand. It reverses the expected dynamic. The silent one becomes the center of gravity, while the one seeking connection becomes the supplicant. In this way, silence becomes a throne. And the tragedy is that it often works not because the manipulator is cruel, but because they, too, are trapped in unmet needs, in fear of vulnerability, in a warped belief that love must be earned through suffering. But the deeper implication is this: if silence can control, then every relationship carries the potential for invisible coercion. We begin to question not just others, but ourselves. Have I used silence to punish? Have I withheld words to gain compliance? The game is so subtle, so normalized, that we may not even recognize when we're playing it. And when we do, we face a quiet reckoning. True connection cannot thrive in the shadow of emotional starvation. Now, let's turn to a different kind of manipulation, one that doesn't push you away, but pulls you in with a reflection so perfect, it blurs the line between you and them. There's a moment, subtle and intoxicating, when you meet someone and it feels as though the world has quietly aligned itself in your favor. You mention an obscure novel you love, and their eyes light up with genuine recognition. You pause mid-sentence, and they finish your thought as if they've lived inside your mind. They lean forward when you do, cross their legs the same way, laugh at the exact moment you do, like two dancers moving to the same unheard rhythm. It feels like serendipity. Like destiny. Like finally being seen. But beneath that magnetic connection lies a quiet artistry, a carefully tuned performance known as mirroring, a psychological dance where one person becomes, for a time, a flawless reflection of another. Mirroring is not inherently malicious. In fact, it's a natural part of human bonding. Infants mirror their caregivers' facial expressions, building the first bridges of attachment. Therapists use mirroring to foster trust, subtly matching a client's posture or tone to create a sense of safety and understanding. Salespeople are trained to echo a customer's language to build rapport. These are neutral, even beneficial, applications of a deep-seated social instinct. We trust those who resemble us. Evolutionarily, similarity signaled belonging, and belonging meant survival. So when someone mirrors us, gestures, speech patterns, values, even breathing rhythm, we instinctively relax. Our defenses lower. We feel understood. And in that openness, influence takes root. But when mirroring becomes intentional, strategic, and sustained, it ceases to be empathy and transforms into a tool of manipulation. Con artists, narcissists, cult leaders, and emotional predators use it with precision. They study their target, their favorite phrases, their political views, their emotional triggers, and then reflect them back with uncanny accuracy. They don't challenge. They don't disagree. They become the perfect companion, the soulmate who just gets you in a way no one else ever has. And because this connection feels so authentic, so effortless, the victim rarely suspects it's constructed. The manipulator isn't revealing themselves, they're erasing themselves, becoming a vessel for the other's identity. In doing so, they create a bond that feels deeper than reality. The danger lies in how seamlessly this illusion is woven. You don't feel manipulated. You feel found. You believe you've met someone who shares your essence, when in truth, they've simply learned to wear your shadow as a mask. Over time, the boundaries between you begin to blur. You start to define yourself through their reflection. Your opinions feel validated not because they're yours, but because they're echoed. Your emotions feel real because they're mirrored back with intensity. And in this feedback loop, your sense of self becomes dependent on their gaze. You begin to wonder, am I loving them, or am I in love with the version of myself they reflect? It's a question that leads into unsettling territory, because if identity is shaped by how we are seen, then a perfect mirror doesn't reveal who we are. It distorts us, smoothing out our edges, amplifying our desires, erasing our contradictions until we see only what we want to see. This is where the philosophical unease begins. If a person can become your mirror so completely, what does that say about the stability of identity? Are we, in part, made of reflections, shaped by the people who look back at us? And if someone can mimic those reflections flawlessly, do we ever truly know another person, or are we always dancing with projections? The ancient Greeks believed that to know oneself, one must gaze into a mirror. But what if the mirror is not glass, but another human being? And what if that mirror is not passive, but actively shaping the image it returns? Worse still, mirroring can become a form of emotional entrapment. Once trust is established through this false intimacy, the manipulator can gradually shift the reflection. They begin to introduce ideas, values, or behaviors, still framed as your own. You've always believed in living fearlessly, they might say, before suggesting a reckless decision. You told me freedom is the most important thing, they remind you, as they isolate you from friends or family. The manipulation is seamless because it's disguised as self-discovery. You don't feel controlled, you feel liberated. But the voice guiding you is not your own. It's a reflection that has learned to speak first. And perhaps the most haunting aspect of mirroring is that it reveals a vulnerability at the heart of human connection. We crave recognition so deeply that we may accept a counterfeit if it feels true. We would rather believe in a beautiful illusion than face the loneliness of being unseen. That longing, so human, so universal, is what makes mirroring not just a tactic, but a tragedy. It exploits our deepest need for belonging by giving us a version of it that looks real, feels real, but is built on absence. So when you meet someone who feels like home, pause. Listen not just to their words, but to their silence. Watch not just for similarity, but for difference. Because a person who never challenges you, never surprises you, never exists outside your shadow, may not be your mirror at all. Now, let's turn to a different kind of illusion, one where affection isn't reflected, but flooded, overwhelming you with a love so intense, it feels like salvation, until it becomes a trap. It begins with a rush, a sensation so bright and overwhelming it feels like waking up for the first time. Suddenly, you are the center of someone's universe. Texts flood your phone at all hours, each one more poetic than the last. They remember the smallest detail you mention in passing, a childhood pet, a favorite song from 10 years ago, and surprise you with a gift that proves they were listening. They call you their soulmate within days. They speak of destiny, of cosmic alignment, of a love so rare it defies logic. Their presence is constant, their affection boundless, their admiration absolute. You feel seen, cherished, chosen. It's intoxicating. It's euphoric. It's exactly what you've always dreamed love would feel like. But beneath the golden surface of this perfect beginning lies a current pulling you deeper into something far more dangerous: love bombing, the emotional equivalent of a sugar rush that leaves you starving in the dark. Love bombing is not simply enthusiasm. It is not the natural excitement of a new connection. It is an intense, disproportionate outpouring of affection designed to overwhelm, to bypass rational judgment, and to fast-track emotional attachment. The love bomber doesn't build intimacy slowly, they detonate it. They flood the emotional landscape with grand gestures, constant communication, and declarations of eternal love, all in a compressed period of time. This isn't courtship. It's psychological saturation. And its purpose is not to know you, but to own you, before you even realize the game has begun. The mechanism is neurological as much as emotional. When someone showers you with attention, your brain responds with a surge of dopamine, the same chemical released during pleasurable experiences like eating, sex, or using certain drugs. This creates a powerful, almost addictive high. You begin to crave their presence, their words, their validation. The relationship becomes your primary source of emotional nourishment, and everything else, friends, work, hobbies, begins to fade into the background. You don't notice the imbalance at first, because the feeling is so good. But that's the trap: the more intense the high, the deeper the dependency. And dependency is control in its most elegant disguise. What makes love bombing so effective is that it fulfills a primal longing, the desire to be deeply wanted, to matter completely to another person. In a world where so many feel invisible, to be overseen can feel like salvation. The love bomber doesn't just like you, they worship you. And in that worship, you begin to believe in a version of yourself that is flawless, irreplaceable, destined. But this version is not based on reality. It's a fantasy, carefully constructed to make you dependent on their gaze. Once you're hooked on their admiration, the real manipulation can begin. The love bomber may slowly withdraw their affection, introduce criticism, or create crises that only they can resolve. And because you're already emotionally invested, because you've been conditioned to equate love with intensity, you're more likely to endure mistreatment, to rationalize the shift, to believe that if you just love them harder, the golden days will return. But perhaps the most unsettling truth about love bombing is that the bomber isn't always a calculating villain. Sometimes, they are caught in their own emotional whirlwind, driven by a desperate need to be loved, to be needed, to fill an inner void. They may genuinely believe in the grandeur of their feelings in the moment. Narcissists, individuals with borderline personality disorder, or those with deep attachment wounds often engage in love bombing not out of malice, but out of a fractured sense of self that requires constant external validation. They don't create the fantasy to destroy you, they create it to survive. And in their need, they pull others into the storm. This raises a haunting question: can love be too much? Society teaches us to seek passion, intensity, grand gestures. We celebrate whirlwind romances and soulmate narratives. But when affection is weaponized, when it's used not to nurture, but to bind, what remains of authenticity? Is it still love if it's designed to addict? If every compliment is a hook, every gift a tether, every "I've never felt this way before" a line in a script? And if we are drawn to such intensity, does that reveal a vulnerability in us all, a willingness to trade freedom for the illusion of being chosen? love bombing also reflects a deeper cultural sickness, our obsession with extremes. We value the dramatic over the steady, the explosive over the enduring. We mistake obsession for devotion, dependency for intimacy. And in doing so, we become easy prey for those who know how to perform love better than they can live it. But awareness is the antidote. To recognize love bombing is not to reject passion, but to demand balance. Real love does not rush. It does not suffocate. It does not make you lose yourself in the name of finding someone else. Real love leaves room to breathe, to doubt, to grow. It doesn't begin with fireworks, it begins with presence. And when the fireworks fade, as they always do, only the steady flame remains. Now, let's turn to a different kind of trap, one not built on heat, but on cold. A manipulation so quiet, so still, it doesn't demand your attention. It simply makes you afraid to lose it. There's a quiet moment, often late at night, when the weight of a single sentence settles into your chest like a stone. You've voiced a concern, a boundary, or even a simple need, and in response, they look at you, not with anger, but with a calm, almost sorrowful certainty, and say, "You really think someone else would put up with you? You'll never find anyone like me." The words hang in the air, soft and final. No shouting. No drama. Just a quiet assertion that feels less like a boast and more like a verdict. And in that instant, something shifts. Your breath catches. Your protest dies in your throat. The thought of being alone, not just physically, but emotionally, existentially, rises like a shadow, vast and suffocating. This is the manipulation of abandonment fear, one of the most profound and devastating mind games, because it doesn't attack your logic. It attacks your worth. At its core, the fear of abandonment is not about being left, it's about being unlovable. It taps into one of the earliest and most primal anxieties we carry, the terror of being cast out, unseen, unwanted. As infants, our survival depended on the presence of a caregiver. To be abandoned was to die. That fear never truly leaves us. It evolves, shaping our attachment styles, our relationships, our deepest insecurities. Some of us become anxious, clinging to connection at all costs. Others become avoidant, building walls to preempt rejection. But all of us, to some degree, carry the echo of that ancient dread. What if no one stays? And the manipulator knows this. They don't need to threaten violence or punishment. They simply imply that your value is conditional, that love is a rare gift they alone are willing to give, and that if you lose them, you may never be chosen again. This tactic is insidious because it often arrives cloaked in care. "I'm the only one who really understands you," they might say, or "other people don't see your potential like I do." On the surface, it sounds like devotion. But beneath it is a subtle coercion. "You need me. No one else will have you. So endure what I do, because the alternative is worse." And because the fear of abandonment is so deeply wired into our psyche, the threat doesn't need to be explicit. A sigh, a distant look, a delayed reply, these can all become signals that the door might close. You begin to police your behavior, suppressing your needs, swallowing your anger, bending yourself into whatever shape keeps them close. You tolerate disrespect, isolation, even cruelty, not because you agree with it, but because the cost of leaving feels unbearable. The prison isn't built with locks or bars. It's built with the quiet certainty that you are, at your core, unlovable without them. What makes this manipulation so effective is that it's not always deliberate. The manipulator may genuinely believe they are irreplaceable. They may even believe they're protecting you, shielding you from a world they see as harsh and indifferent. In codependent relationships, both parties often play roles in this dance. One fears abandonment, the other fears being unneeded. They become entangled in a cycle where control is disguised as necessity, and dependency is mistaken for love. The one who fears being left stays. The one who fears being useless dominates. And the relationship thrives on mutual insecurity, not mutual growth. But the deeper implication of this mind game is that it reveals how power flows through vulnerability. Control doesn't always come from strength. Sometimes, it comes from knowing someone's weakness and holding it like a secret. The manipulator doesn't need to be loud or violent. They only need to know that you fear being alone, and then make sure you never forget it. In authoritarian systems, this plays out on a societal scale. Governments isolate citizens, destroy trust in others, and position themselves as the only source of safety. Without us, they imply, chaos will consume you. The same psychological mechanism applies. Make people afraid of the void, and they will cling to any hand that offers to pull them out, even if that hand is also the one pushing them in. And yet, the most haunting truth is that we all carry this fear. It is not a flaw. It is human. We are social creatures, wired for connection. To be seen, to be held, to be remembered, these are not luxuries. They are necessities. But when that need is exploited, love becomes a currency, and intimacy becomes a transaction. You don't stay because you want to. You stay because you can't imagine leaving. And in that space, freedom becomes terrifying, because freedom means facing the possibility that you might not be enough on your own. But here lies the path to liberation, the realization that worth is not granted. It is inherent. That love should not be a lifeline, but a choice. That the fear of abandonment, while real, does not have to dictate your life. The manipulator holds the key only as long as you believe the door leads to nothing. But what if it doesn't? What if, on the other side of that door, is not emptiness, but yourself? Now, let's turn to another form of control, one that doesn't threaten to leave, but instead shapes the very story you tell about your life. There is a moment after every argument, every misunderstanding, every fracture in a relationship, when the mind begins to reconstruct what happened. You replay the words, the tone, the glances, the sequence of events that led to the rupture. And in that mental theater, you become both witness and storyteller, shaping the memory into a narrative that makes sense of the pain. But so does the other person. And more often than not, the two stories don't align. Not because one of you is lying, but because each of you has framed the event differently, highlighting certain details, omitting others, assigning motive, casting roles. One of you was defending yourself. The other was being attacked. One was trying to help. The other was being controlled. And in this quiet divergence of stories, a deeper truth emerges. Reality is not fixed. It is narrated. And whoever controls the narrative, controls the truth. Framing is not about deception in the traditional sense. It doesn't require falsehoods or outright lies. Instead, it operates through selection, emphasis, and language, the subtle art of shaping perception by deciding what to include, how to describe it, and what to leave in the shadows. A single event can be framed as betrayal or as self-defense, as neglect or as independence, as love or as suffocation, depending on who tells the story and how they tell it. A partner might say, "I was trying to protect you," when they were actually isolating you from friends. A manager might claim, "I'm holding you to high standards," while systematically undermining your confidence. A politician might call a policy freedom, while others name it abandonment. The facts may remain the same, but the meaning shifts entirely. This is the power of framing. It doesn't change what happened. It changes how we feel about it. Consider a simple example. Two people in a relationship disagree about spending time together. One says, "You never make time for me. I'm always waiting for you to show up." The other responds, "You're suffocating me. I need space to breathe." Same situation. Opposite narratives. In one, the speaker is the victim of neglect. In the other, the victim of control. Neither may be lying. Both may genuinely feel what they say. But the framing determines who appears reasonable, who appears selfish, and ultimately, who holds moral authority. And moral authority is power. It influences how others see the conflict. It shapes interventions from friends or family. It can even determine whether the relationship continues or ends. The one who controls the story often controls the outcome. This isn't just personal. It's political, cultural, historical. Nations are built on narratives. Wars are justified through them. Social movements rise or fall based on how their cause is framed. The civil rights movement was not just a struggle for equality, it was framed as a moral awakening, a return to America's founding ideals. Climate change is not just a scientific phenomenon, it is framed as either an existential crisis or a hoax, depending on who speaks. The same data, the same events, the same words, divergent realities, born from the way they are presented. As philosopher Michel Foucault observed, knowledge is not neutral. It is shaped by power. And the power to define is the power to dominate. But the most unsettling aspect of narrative framing is how deeply it shapes our sense of self. We don't just tell stories about events. We tell stories about who we are. And when someone else controls that story, they begin to shape your identity. A parent might say, "You've always been so sensitive," and over time, you internalize that label, not as a trait, but as a flaw. A partner might insist, "You're the one who's always angry," until you start questioning your own emotions, wondering if your anger is justified or just irrational. These narratives become lenses through which you see yourself. And because they are repeated, reinforced, and often delivered by people we trust, they feel like truth. But they are not truth. They are interpretations, curated, selective, often self-serving. What makes this manipulation so difficult to resist is that it feels like clarity. The person framing the narrative isn't shouting. They're explaining. They're making sense of chaos. And in a world full of ambiguity, that sense-making is seductive. We crave coherence. We want to believe there's a reason for the pain, a cause for the conflict, a hero and a villain. The manipulator offers that clarity, but at a cost. They position themselves as the rational one, the wronged one, the one who sees clearly, while casting you as the irrational, the unstable, the one who just doesn't understand. And because you want to be understood, you begin to doubt your own version. You start to wonder, maybe I am too sensitive. Maybe I did overreact. Maybe I'm the problem. And in that doubt, the narrative solidifies. Their version becomes the official record. Even more insidious is the way framing can make you complicit in your own erasure. You begin to edit your own memories, downplaying your pain, excusing their behavior, rewriting events to fit the accepted story. You say, "I guess I was being dramatic," or "I should have handled it better," not because it's true, but because the dominant narrative demands it. You become the co-author of your own silencing. And in doing so, you lose not just the argument, but a piece of yourself. But here lies a quiet rebellion, the act of reclaiming your narrative. To say, "This is how I remember it. This is how I felt. This is my truth." Not as an attack, but as an assertion of existence. Because if reality is made of stories, then no single voice should have the final say. There is no objective truth, only multiple truths, each valid, each partial, each shaped by perspective. To recognize framing is not to descend into nihilism, but to awaken to the power of language, of memory, of voice. And in that awakening, there is freedom. Not the freedom of absolute truth, but the freedom to question, to resist, to speak. Now, let's turn to a deeper layer of manipulation, one that doesn't just shape the story, but makes you believe you wrote it yourself. There is a moment in every manipulation, subtle and decisive, when freedom is offered, not as liberation, but as a trap. You're standing at a crossroads, or so it seems. One path leads to trust, loyalty, belonging. The other leads to isolation, failure, exile. You can either trust me, they say, or walk away. The words are calm, almost generous. They gesture toward an open door. You are free to leave. But the air is thick with implication. If you walk out, you'll be alone. If you stay, you must surrender. There is no third option. No middle ground. No possibility of renegotiation. This is the false dilemma, a narrowing of reality into two extremes, both carefully constructed to serve the manipulator's will. It feels like a choice. But it is not. It is coercion dressed as autonomy. A false dilemma, also known as a false dichotomy, is a logical fallacy that reduces a complex situation to only two possible outcomes, erasing nuance, alternatives, and gray areas. In honest discourse, it's a flaw in reasoning. In manipulation, it's a weapon. By presenting a binary, the manipulator eliminates the possibility of critical thinking. You are not invited to explore, to question, to imagine other paths. You are forced to pick a side. And both sides lead to the same destination, compliance. Whether you choose to trust or walk away, the manipulator wins. If you stay, you've submitted. If you leave, they can paint you as disloyal, unstable, or weak, further justifying their control to others. The illusion of choice makes the outcome feel inevitable, even moral. You didn't lose your freedom. You exercised it. And that's what makes the trap so effective. Consider the cult leader who tells their followers, "It's us or chaos." The world outside is corrupt, dangerous, meaningless. Here, you have truth, safety, purpose. The dichotomy is stark, enlightenment or damnation. Belonging or annihilation. There is no suggestion that the outside world might contain beauty, truth, or growth. No acknowledgement that doubt is not betrayal, or that questioning is not disloyalty. The same logic appears in authoritarian regimes: support the leader, or you're with the enemy. In abusive relationships, if you loved me, you wouldn't need space. In workplaces, you're either fully committed, or you don't care about your career. Each of these frames a vast spectrum of human experience into a single, suffocating either/or. And in that narrowing, freedom dissolves. What makes the false dilemma so psychologically potent is that it exploits our need for closure. The human mind dislikes uncertainty. We crave resolution, clarity, decisiveness. When faced with ambiguity, we experience cognitive dissonance, a discomfort that drives us to make a choice, even a poor one, just to restore mental peace. The manipulator knows this. They don't need to force you. They only need to make the alternatives feel unbearable. Stay and submit, or leave and lose everything. Believe me, or become a traitor to everything we stand for. Love me completely, or you never loved me at all. These are not invitations to dialogue. They are emotional ultimatums disguised as logic. But the deeper horror lies in what the false dilemma reveals about the nature of freedom itself. Are we ever truly free, Or are our choices always shaped, limited, and directed by forces we don't see? Philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre argued that we are condemned to be free, that we must choose, even in the absence of perfect options. But what if the options themselves are illusions? What if every choice we make is actually a selection from a menu designed by someone else, by society, by family, by culture, by the people who hold power over us? The capitalist tells you, work or starve. The traditionalist says, conform or be alone. The nationalist declares, our way or chaos. These are not neutral choices. They are engineered constraints, false dilemmas scaled to the level of entire civilizations. And in our personal lives, the same mechanisms operate in quieter tones. A partner says, if you really cared, you'd spend every weekend with my family. A parent insists, you can either go to medical school or waste your life. A friend implies, if you don't support me unconditionally, you're not a real friend. Each of these statements collapses a universe of possibility into a single, suffocating fork in the road. There is no room for compromise, for exploration, for growth. You must choose, and whichever path you take, you are bound. The most insidious part of the false dilemma is that it makes you complicit in your own manipulation. You walk through the door they opened, believing you made the decision. You tell yourself you chose loyalty over abandonment, commitment over failure, love over loss. But the door was the only one they showed you. The other exits were walled off, dismissed as unrealistic, irresponsible, or selfish. And because you walked through it willingly, you cannot claim to be trapped. You were free. And that belief, that you had a choice, becomes the chain that holds you in place. But awareness is the first crack in the illusion. To recognize a false dilemma is to see the hidden options, the unspoken alternatives, the paths that were never offered. Maybe you don't have to trust blindly or walk away. Maybe you can ask questions, set boundaries, demand transparency. Maybe you don't have to burn out or fail. Maybe you can redefine success. Maybe you don't have to belong to a group or be alone. Maybe you can forge a new way. The moment you realize the dichotomy is false, the spell begins to break. Freedom is not the ability to choose between two extremes. It is the ability to question the terms of the choice itself. Now, let's turn to a different kind of manipulation, one that doesn't limit your choices, but distorts the very fabric that holds them together, time. There is a peculiar kind of exhaustion that comes not from labor, but from waiting. You sit in a sterile office, phone in hand, having arrived precisely on time for a meeting that was scheduled weeks ago. The minutes stretch into an hour. No apology. No update. Just silence. And then, just as your mind begins to fray at the edges, doubting whether you were forgotten, whether you misread the time, the door swings open. Ah, you're still here, they say, as if your presence were a surprise. Before you can gather your thoughts, they launch into a rapid-fire proposal. We need an answer now. The opportunity expires in 10 minutes. You're expected to decide, to commit, to sign, while your nervous system is still reeling from the indignity of being ignored. This is not bad scheduling. This is time manipulation, the deliberate distortion of temporal experience to destabilize, disorient, and dominate. Time, in its raw form, is neutral, a constant, unyielding rhythm measured by clocks and seasons. But in human interaction, time is malleable. It can be stretched, compressed, weaponized. Manipulators understand this intuitively. They know that our cognitive clarity, our emotional equilibrium, and our sense of agency are all deeply tied to our perception of time. When time flows predictably, we feel grounded. We can reflect, deliberate, weigh consequences. But when time is disrupted, When we are kept in suspense or forced into haste, our higher functions falter. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational decision-making, gives way to the amygdala, the seat of fear and impulse. And in that vulnerable state, we become far more suggestible, far more likely to comply. There are two primary forms of time manipulation, the slow burn and the sudden rush. The first involves delay, intentional lateness, unanswered messages, withheld responses. By making you wait, the manipulator induces anxiety. Your mind races. You begin to question your importance, your worth, even your memory of the agreement. Did I do something wrong? Am I being punished? Should I just give in to make it stop? The longer the silence, the more power they accumulate. You become emotionally starved, craving resolution, and when it finally comes, you're so relieved that you'll agree to almost anything just to restore stability. Cult leaders use this to break down recruits. Abusive partners use it to reinforce dependence. Institutions use it to assert dominance. The DMV, the corporate hierarchy, the gatekeeper who controls access to opportunity. The second form is acceleration, forcing decisions under artificial deadlines. This offer ends tonight. If you're not on board now, you'll be replaced. We need your answer before the meeting ends. These are not organic timelines. They are manufactured crises, designed to bypass reflection. When we are rushed, we default to emotion, habit, or the path of least resistance. We don't ask questions. We don't seek alternatives. We don't consult others. We act, often in ways that serve someone else's agenda. Salespeople are trained in this tactic. So are hostage negotiators, dictators, and toxic partners who demand immediate forgiveness after a blow-up. The message is always the same: decide now, or lose everything. And because loss looms larger in the human psyche than gain, we choose compliance. What makes time manipulation so philosophically unsettling is that it strikes at the heart of our being. Martin Heidegger argued that time is not merely a measurement, but the very structure of human existence. We are beings in time, projecting ourselves into the future, rooted in the past, experiencing the present as a fleeting horizon of possibility. To be human is to dwell in duration, to make sense of life through narrative, through anticipation, through patience. But when time is distorted, that narrative fractures. The future becomes a threat. The past feels unreliable. The present is too urgent to inhabit. You are no longer a self unfolding through time. You are a reaction, a reflex, a puppet dancing to someone else's rhythm. And in a world increasingly defined by urgency, by 24-hour news cycles, instant messaging, and the cult of productivity, this manipulation has become normalized. We are all conditioned to respond faster, to decide quicker, to fear missing out. The manipulator doesn't need to invent artificial deadlines. They simply exploit the cultural anxiety around time. You're falling behind. Everyone else has already decided. This moment won't come again. These phrases don't just pressure, they reframe existence as a race, and anyone who pauses is a loser. But the deepest implication of time manipulation is this: to control someone's experience of time is to control their reality. You cannot think freely if you are always behind. You cannot feel secure if you are always rushing. You cannot assert boundaries if every moment feels like an emergency. And so, the manipulator doesn't need to lie, threaten, or dominate overtly. They only need to own the clock. Yet resistance is possible. It begins with awareness, recognizing that time can be a weapon. It grows in the quiet act of pausing, of saying, "I need to think about this," of refusing to be rushed or ignored. Because within that pause lies power, the power to recenter, to reflect, to reclaim your own rhythm. Now, let us turn to another dimension of control, one where truth is not denied, but buried beneath words that mean everything and nothing at once. There is a moment in conversation, subtle, almost imperceptible, when the ground beneath your understanding shifts. You recall clearly what was said, the promise made, the agreement reached. But then, with a calm tone and a slight tilt of the head, they say, "What I meant was," and in that breath, the past is rewritten. The commitment you thought you heard dissolves into ambiguity. The obligation vanishes, not because it was denied, but because the words have been reshaped, their meaning quietly altered. This is semantic manipulation, not a lie, but a linguistic sleight of hand, where language is bent, twisted, or hollowed out to evade accountability, obscure intent, and maintain control. It is the art of saying something while meaning another, of using words not to communicate, but to confuse. Semantic manipulation thrives in the fluidity of language. Words are not fixed. They carry connotations, contexts, histories. And a skilled manipulator exploits that elasticity. They use vague terms, soon, eventually, we'll see, that sound like promises but commit to nothing. They deploy qualifiers. I thought you wanted this, or I assumed we were on the same page, shifting responsibility onto you. They redefine words mid-conversation. When I said forever, I meant as long as it feels right. Or they retreat into technicalities. I never said I'd do it, even though their tone, their gestures, their silence all implied agreement. The effect is disorienting. You begin to question not just their honesty, but your own memory. Did they say it? Did you misunderstand? Were you expecting too much? The manipulator remains blameless, shielded by the precision of their wording, while the weight of confusion falls on you. This tactic is especially insidious because it masquerades as clarity. The manipulator often appears reasonable, even precise. Let's be clear, they might say, before redefining the terms of the relationship, the agreement, the argument. In doing so, they seize control of the conversation's framework. Once meaning is unstable, truth becomes negotiable. You can no longer trust the words you heard, because their significance can be retroactively altered. This is not mere evasion, it is a dismantling of shared reality. If we cannot agree on what words mean, we cannot agree on what happened. And without that foundation, dialogue collapses into power play. The implications of semantic manipulation reach far beyond personal relationships. It is a cornerstone of propaganda, bureaucracy, and authoritarian control. George Orwell foresaw this in 1984 with the invention of Newspeak, a language designed to shrink thought by eliminating words for freedom, rebellion, and dissent. War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. These slogans are not just contradictions, they are semantic traps, forcing the mind to accept paradox as truth. When language is corrupted, thinking becomes distorted. When words no longer point to reality, reality itself begins to blur. In modern politics, we see this in the rebranding of war as liberation, of surveillance as security, of censorship as content moderation. The labels change. The power remains. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of semantic manipulation is how it erodes trust and communication itself. Language is our primary tool for connection, for empathy, for building shared worlds. When that tool is weaponized, every conversation becomes suspect. You begin to analyze not just what is said, but what might be unsaid. You replay conversations in your mind, searching for loopholes, hidden meanings, escape routes the other person might later use. Intimacy suffers, because true vulnerability requires faith in the sincerity of words. If every phrase could be reinterpreted, if every promise could be unmade with a sigh and a "what I meant was," then openness becomes dangerous. You withdraw. You protect yourself with silence or equal ambiguity. And in that retreat, relationship dies not with a shout, but with the slow decay of meaning. Philosophers have long recognized the power of language to shape thought. The German philosopher Wilhelm von Humboldt believed that language is not merely a means of expression, but the very medium through which we perceive the world. We do not think in language, we think through it. So when language is manipulated, perception is altered. When words lose their stability, so does identity. If you can't trust what someone means when they say love, commitment, or truth, then you can't trust the foundation of the bond you thought you shared. And if entire societies accept shifting definitions of justice, freedom, or reality, then collective sanity begins to fray. Yet resistance begins with attention. With listening not just to words, but to their consistency. With refusing to accept redefinitions that serve only to evade. With saying, "That's not what you said. That's not what we agreed on." It is an act of quiet courage to uphold meaning in a world that increasingly treats words as malleable tools of power rather than vessels of truth. Because if we lose the shared understanding of language, we lose the possibility of shared reality. Now, let us turn to a force even more primal than words, something that bypasses language entirely, spreading through the air like a current, invisible but undeniable. You step into a room and immediately feel it, a low hum of tension, a weight in the air, as if the atmosphere itself has thickened. No one says a word. No one gestures. But your breath grows shallow, your shoulders tighten, your thoughts quicken with unease. You assume you're reacting to stress of your own, until you notice her, seated quietly, eyes downcast, radiating a quiet sorrow. Or him, pacing slightly, jaw clenched, fingers tapping a rapid rhythm on the armrest. And then it dawns on you, your anxiety isn't yours. It's been borrowed. Transmitted. Caught, like a virus passed through the air. This is emotional contagion, the silent, subconscious transfer of emotion from one person to another, a phenomenon so natural we rarely notice it, until it's being used against us. Emotional contagion is not metaphor. It is biological, neurological, deeply wired into our social fabric. Studies in neuroscience have shown that when we observe someone else's emotional expression, facial cues, tone of voice, posture, our mirror neurons fire as if we were experiencing that emotion ourselves. A smile triggers warmth in the observer. A frown induces tension. A raised voice spikes adrenaline. We don't just see emotion, we catch it. This mechanism evolved for survival. In early human groups, the ability to rapidly share emotional states, fear at a predator's approach, joy at a shared meal, urgency in a crisis, allowed for faster, more cohesive responses. It helped tribes move as one. But in the modern world, this ancient wiring has become a tool of influence, wielded with precision by those who understand its power. Manipulators, whether in relationships, families, workplaces, or political arenas, often exploit emotional contagion deliberately. They don't need to argue or command. They only need to feel loudly. A partner might not say, "You should feel guilty," but instead sit in silence with a heavy sigh and a distant gaze, radiating disappointment until you begin to apologize, unsure of what you've done. A leader might not issue a directive, but flood a meeting with urgency, speaking quickly, leaning forward, furrowing their brow, until the entire room feels the pressure to act now, without questioning. A parent might not forbid a choice, but respond with a slow, sorrowful, "I just thought you'd want to spend time with us," transmitting sadness so potent it overrides your plans. In each case, the emotion is not shared, it is implanted. And because it feels internal, you believe it's your own. This is what makes emotional contagion so insidious. It bypasses logic entirely. You don't debate the feeling. You don't analyze it. You simply have it. And when an emotion feels real, its origin becomes irrelevant. If you're anxious, you assume there's a threat. If you're sad, you assume there's a loss. You look inward for the cause, never realizing the emotion was seeded from outside. The manipulator, meanwhile, remains blameless. They never said, "Make yourself feel this way." They only felt, and you caught it, like a cold in winter. But the deeper implication is far more unsettling. If your emotions can be transmitted without your awareness, then how much of your inner life is truly yours? We like to believe we are autonomous beings, governed by our own thoughts and feelings. But emotional contagion suggests a different truth. We are not isolated minds, but porous beings, constantly exchanging psychological states with those around us. We are less like sealed vessels and more like open circuits in a shared network. Your joy might lift a friend. Your anger might ignite a crowd. But the reverse is also true. Your mood can be shaped, steered, even hijacked by someone who knows how to broadcast emotion with intent. This blurs the boundary between self and other. If you walk out of a conversation feeling drained, agitated, or suddenly doubtful, was that your reaction, or their projection? If you find yourself crying without knowing why, is it grief, or are you simply echoing someone else's sorrow? The more attuned we are to others, the more vulnerable we become to this invisible transfer. Empaths, highly sensitive people, caregivers, those who feel deeply, are often the most affected. They absorb the emotional weather of every room they enter, sometimes at the cost of their own equilibrium. And in group settings, emotional contagion becomes a force of mass influence. A single angry voice can shift the tone of an entire meeting. A leader's calm can soothe a panicked team. A demagogue's rage can spread through a crowd like wildfire, turning individuals into a unified, emotional mob. Social media amplifies this effect, where outrage, fear, and euphoria travel at digital speed, shaping public sentiment not through argument, but through emotional resonance. We don't need to agree with a message to be moved by it, we only need to feel it. The philosophical consequence is profound. If emotion can be contagious, then autonomy is not absolute. We are not fully self-determined. We are, in part, emotional ecosystems, shaped by the unseen currents flowing between us. This doesn't diminish our humanity, it reveals its interconnectedness. But it also demands vigilance. To preserve the integrity of the self, we must learn to pause, to ask, did I arrive at this feeling on my own? Or was it given to me? Not to reject empathy, but to distinguish between shared feeling and emotional coercion. Because the right to feel is sacred. But so is the right to feel your feelings. Now, let us turn to those who understand this network so well. They choose to step outside of it, not to disconnect, but to watch from the shadows. There's a quiet shift that occurs when you realize you're being watched, not by an intruder, not by a stranger, but by someone who knows you, someone who claims to care. You're alone in your thoughts, perhaps scrolling through your phone, reacting to a meme with a private laugh, or sighing after a long day. Then a voice comes, soft and seemingly casual. You've been on your phone a lot today. Or a text arrives, just checking in, everything okay? No accusation. No anger. Just presence. But something changes in you. You put the phone down. You straighten your posture. You begin to act, more carefully, more deliberately, as if suddenly performing a version of yourself that is more acceptable, more responsible, more lovable. This is the observer effect, the phenomenon where the mere awareness of being watched alters behavior. And when that awareness is cultivated on purpose, observation becomes manipulation. In quantum physics, the observer effect describes how the act of measuring a particle changes its state. You cannot observe something without interacting with it. In human psychology, the principle holds a haunting parallel. We are not neutral when we are seen. The moment we know we are being watched, by a partner, a parent, a boss, or even the invisible gaze of social media algorithms, our actions shift. We conform. We suppress. We perform. We become less spontaneous, less authentic, more cautious. And manipulators understand this deeply. They don't always need to command or punish. They only need to make you feel observed. A lingering glance. A vague comment about your habits. A sudden interest in your routine. These are not necessarily acts of love or concern. They are signals, I am watching. Adjust accordingly. This form of control is subtle because it doesn't feel like control. It feels like accountability. Like care. Like normal interaction. But over time, the effect is cumulative. You begin to internalize the gaze. You don't wait for the check-in text, you anticipate it. You don't need to be told to behave, you self-censor before the thought fully forms. You start asking yourself, how would they see this? What would they think if they knew? The external observer fades into the background, replaced by an internal one, a voice in your mind that polices your choices, your emotions, your very identity. You are no longer just being watched. You are watching yourself, through their eyes. And in that act, you become a performance, polished, edited, shaped to meet the expectations of the unseen audience. The implications of this are profound. Surveillance, in its most intimate form, is not about gathering information. It's about shaping behavior. It's not about knowing who you are, it's about making you into who they want you to be. When you are always watched, authenticity becomes dangerous. Spontaneity feels like risk. Vulnerability feels like exposure. And so, you retreat into a curated self, one that is safe, predictable, agreeable. The real you, the messy, uncertain, contradictory self, goes underground. And in its place, a persona emerges, the version of you that is designed to be seen. This dynamic plays out in relationships where one partner uses emotional surveillance to maintain dominance. I noticed you didn't reply right away. You seemed distant at dinner. You've been talking to your friend a lot lately. These statements aren't questions. They are reminders. I am paying attention. You are accountable. In families, parents may use it to enforce conformity. I saw what you posted online, or your teacher mentioned you've been quiet in class. In workplaces, managers track productivity not just through output, but through digital footprints, email response times, screen activity, calendar usage, creating a culture where employees perform diligence even when they're not working. And in the digital age, the observer effect has scaled to a global level. Every click, every search, every pause on a video is recorded, analyzed, and used to shape what you see, what you buy, what you believe. We are all, in a sense, living in an experiment where the observers are invisible, the rules are unknown, and the outcome is behavioral control. But the most unsettling question remains: if we are constantly being shaped by the gaze of others, do we ever truly exist outside of performance? Are we, at our core, individuals, or are we reflections, constantly adjusting to the light that falls on us? Philosophers like Michel Foucault described this as the panopticon effect, inspired by a prison design where inmates, never knowing if they're being watched, begin to police themselves. The result is not rebellion, but self-discipline. The watcher doesn't need to act. The watched do the work for them. And so, we arrive at a quiet paradox: the more we are seen, the less we are known. Because the self that is displayed under observation is not the self that dreams in silence, grieves in darkness, or laughs without restraint. It is a version, a mask, a compromise. Now, let us turn to those who wield observation not by watching, but by vanishing, those who disappear not to escape, but to gain a different kind of power. There is a rhythm to the abuse that doesn't make sense, until you realize it was never meant to. One day, they're warm, attentive, showering you with affection. They remember your favorite song, bring you coffee just the way you like it, whisper, "I've never loved anyone like I love you." You breathe again. You believe, maybe this time, it will be different. But then, without warning, the shift comes. A cold shoulder. A sharp tone. A withdrawal so complete it feels like abandonment. No explanation. No closure. Just silence. And just when you've begun to accept the distance, it happens again. The sudden return of kindness, the apology, the promise that it will never happen again. This is not chaos. It is design. This is intermittent reinforcement, the psychological engine of addiction, disguised as love. Intermittent reinforcement is a principle rooted in behavioral psychology, most famously demonstrated by B.F. Skinner in his experiments with pigeons and rats. When a reward is delivered consistently, every time a lever is pressed, the subject learns the pattern quickly, but also stops responding as soon as the reward stops. But when the reward is unpredictable, sometimes there, sometimes not, the subject becomes obsessed. They press the lever again and again, long after any rational expectation of reward has faded. This is the mechanism behind slot machines. The random payout keeps players feeding coins into the machine, chasing the next win, convinced it's just one pull away. The brain doesn't crave certainty. It craves the possibility of reward. And that possibility, when dangled unpredictably, becomes irresistible. Now imagine that slot machine as a person. The win isn't money, it's kindness, attention, validation. The loss is indifference, cruelty, silence. The cycle is the same, occasional bursts of affection amid a backdrop of neglect or abuse. And like the gambler at the machine, the victim learns not through logic, but through compulsion. They don't stay because the relationship is good. They stay because they are addicted to the chance that it might be good again. The unpredictability is the hook. The inconsistency is the trap. The brain, flooded with dopamine during moments of connection, begins to crave those highs, while tolerating longer and longer periods of emotional starvation. Each act of kindness feels like a jackpot, reinforcing the belief that if they just wait, just try harder, just love more patiently, the good version will return and stay. This pattern is not limited to romantic relationships. It appears in toxic friendships, where support comes only after long stretches of neglect. In families where a parent alternates between warmth and emotional withdrawal. In workplaces where praise is rare and arbitrary, keeping employees striving endlessly for approval that may never come. And in the digital world, social media platforms exploit intermittent reinforcement with every like, comment, or follower notification, random, unpredictable, yet powerful enough to keep us scrolling for hours, chasing the next hit of validation. We are not merely users of these systems. We are subjects in a vast, invisible experiment in behavioral conditioning. But the deeper horror of intermittent reinforcement lies in what it reveals about human nature. We are not loyal to stability. We are loyal to hope. The brain is wired to respond more intensely to uncertainty than to consistency. A predictable partner may feel safe, but they don't ignite the same obsessive longing as the one who disappears and reappears like a ghost. The mind becomes fixated on the mystery, the possibility, the maybe. Maybe this time they've changed. Maybe they finally see me. Maybe now it will be different. These thoughts are not rational. They are compulsive. And they are sustained by the occasional reward, just enough to keep the cycle alive. Over time, the victim begins to internalize the instability. They stop expecting consistency. They stop setting boundaries. They start justifying the pain. They're going through a lot. They love me in their own way. I can help them heal. These are not signs of weakness. They are symptoms of a mind reshaped by unpredictability. The relationship is no longer evaluated by its overall quality, but by the fleeting moments of light that pierce the darkness. And because those moments feel so intense, so redemptive, they overshadow the suffering that surrounds them. Worse still, intermittent reinforcement erodes self-trust. When kindness comes without reason, and cruelty follows no logic, the victim begins to search for patterns where none exist. They scrutinize their own behavior. Did I say something wrong? Was I too distant? Did I push too hard? They believe that if they can just figure out the code, they can make the good version permanent. But there is no code. The unpredictability is the point. The lack of control is the control. And in that realization, when the victim finally sees the pattern not as a puzzle to solve, but as a trap to escape, the grief is profound. Because what they mourn is not just the person, but the hope they carried. The belief that love could be earned through patience, through sacrifice, through love itself. Letting go means accepting that the reward was never guaranteed. That the game was rigged from the start. But liberation begins there, in the decision to walk away from the slot machine, even when the next pull might be the winning one. Now, let us turn to a different kind of test, one where loyalty is not assumed, but demanded, and where the price of belonging is paid in pieces of the self. There's a moment in certain relationships, subtle, almost imperceptible, when the ground shifts beneath your feet, not with a shout, but with a quiet expectation. You're asked to do something small at first. Ignore a mutual friend who said something critical. Stay silent during a conversation that makes you uncomfortable. Defend someone's actions even when you disagree. It doesn't feel like a demand. It feels like belonging. And then, slowly, the requests grow. You're asked to lie for them. To cut off someone they dislike. To justify something that feels wrong. And when you hesitate, the words come, soft but loaded. Real friends would do this. If you loved me, you'd understand. I guess I just thought you were on my side. These are not arguments. They are loyalty tests, rituals of allegiance disguised as tests of love, friendship, or devotion. And each one is a step deeper into a maze with no map. Loyalty tests are not about trust. They are about control. They are designed not to reveal loyalty, but to extract it through sacrifice. In their most extreme forms, they appear in cults, where new members are asked to donate their savings, sever family ties, or participate in degrading acts. In gangs, where initiation involves violence. In authoritarian systems, where citizens must publicly denounce dissenters to prove their allegiance. But in everyday life, they are far more insidious, woven into the fabric of personal relationships, often without either party recognizing them for what they are. A partner might say, if you really cared, you wouldn't spend time with your sister. A friend might whisper, I only told you this because I know you'd never repeat it, then later accuse you of betrayal if you speak to the person involved. A family member might demand you choose between them and your partner, framing the decision as a measure of your loyalty. What makes these tests so effective is that they exploit one of our deepest desires, to belong. Human beings are not just social creatures, we are tribal. Our survival once depended on being accepted by the group. To be cast out was to face isolation, danger, even death. That primal fear still echoes in our nervous systems. And loyalty tests activate it with precision. They don't just ask for compliance. They frame compliance as the price of connection. To refuse is not just to say no, it is to risk abandonment, rejection, the collapse of the bond you've invested in. And so, you comply. You justify the act to yourself. You minimize its importance. You tell yourself it's a one-time thing, that you're doing it for the relationship, not because you agree. But each act of compliance deepens the trap. This is where psychology takes over, specifically, the phenomenon of cognitive dissonance. When our actions conflict with our beliefs, we experience mental discomfort. To reduce that discomfort, we don't usually change our behavior. We change our beliefs. So when you lie for someone, sabotage a friendship, or betray your own values to prove loyalty, your mind begins to rationalize, they must be worth it. This relationship must be special. Otherwise, why would I have done this? The more you sacrifice, the more you convince yourself that the relationship is valuable, because the alternative is too painful, admitting you've compromised yourself for something that isn't worth it. This creates a self-reinforcing prison. The walls are not built by the manipulator alone. They are built by you, brick by brick, each time you pass a loyalty test. The more you give up, your time, your integrity, your boundaries, the harder it becomes to leave. Walking away would mean confronting the dissonance head-on. I gave up so much. For what? It's easier to stay. Easier to believe in the bond. Easier to keep proving, over and over, that you belong. And in that cycle, loyalty ceases to be a freely given gift. It becomes a debt. A performance. A currency exchanged for the right to be included. You are no longer loved for who you are. You are tolerated for what you endure. The relationship is no longer reciprocal. It is transactional, your loyalty purchased through escalating demands. The most tragic part is that loyalty tests often come from people who genuinely care. A parent may test their child's loyalty out of fear of losing them. A partner may demand exclusivity not out of malice, but out of insecurity. But intention does not erase impact. Even love, when it demands proof, becomes conditional. And conditional love is not freedom. It is obligation wrapped in affection. Moreover, loyalty tests distort the very meaning of loyalty. True loyalty is not proven through sacrifice. It is demonstrated through consistency, honesty, and mutual respect. It does not require you to abandon your principles. It does not thrive on fear. Real belonging does not demand that you erase parts of yourself to stay. It makes space for you to exist fully. But in the world of loyalty tests, authenticity is dangerous. Doubt is betrayal. Independence is rejection. And so, you learn to perform devotion, not live it. And when the final test comes, the one that asks you to destroy something sacred within yourself, you may not even recognize it for what it is. You may simply say yes, because by then, saying no would mean unraveling everything you've built, everything you've justified, everything you've sacrificed. But awareness is the first thread of escape. To see a loyalty test for what it is, a demand disguised as a question, a trap disguised as love, is to regain a measure of power. Because loyalty should never be earned through suffering. It should be given freely, received gratefully, and never weaponized. Now, let us turn inward, to the most invisible prison of all, one not built by others, but constructed within the mind itself. You sit in the quiet aftermath of another argument, the kind that doesn't end with resolution, but with silence. You know, deep in your bones, that something is wrong. The words that were said, the way they looked at you, the coldness that followed, none of it aligns with the idea of love, respect, or safety. And yet, you're still here. You haven't left. You haven't set a boundary. You may even find yourself making excuses. They were stressed. They didn't mean it. They've had a hard life. You know the truth, but you don't act on it. Why? Because between knowing and doing, there is a chasm filled with discomfort, an invisible tension that the mind cannot tolerate for long. This is cognitive dissonance, the psychological friction that arises when your actions conflict with your beliefs, when reality clashes with identity, when love coexists with pain. And to quiet that dissonance, the mind doesn't change the behavior. It changes the story. Cognitive dissonance, first articulated by psychologist Leon Festinger in the 1950s, describes the mental stress people experience when they hold two contradictory ideas at the same time. For example, I am a smart, capable person, and yet, I am staying in a relationship that degrades me. Or, I value honesty, but I keep lying to justify someone else's behavior. The brain, wired for coherence, cannot sustain such contradictions indefinitely. It seeks harmony. And since changing behavior, leaving, confronting, admitting failure, is often emotionally, socially, or existentially costly, the mind takes the path of least resistance. It alters the belief instead. They don't really hurt me. It's not that bad. I'm overreacting. Or worse, they must love me deeply, or they wouldn't stay. The action remains unchanged, but the justification shifts. The dissonance dissolves, not through resolution, but through self-deception. This is not weakness. It is not foolishness. It is a survival mechanism. Human beings are meaning-making creatures. We cannot live in a world that feels random, contradictory, or morally incoherent. We need to believe our choices are valid, our identities stable, our lives coherent. When that narrative is threatened, when the evidence suggests we've made a bad decision, loved the wrong person, trusted the untrustworthy, the mind scrambles to protect the story. It downplays the harm. It magnifies the good. It reframes abuse as passion, neglect as independence, control as care. The result is not clarity, but distortion. You don't see the situation more clearly. You see it in a way that allows you to keep going. Consider the employee who works 80-hour weeks for a boss who belittles them daily. They believe in hard work, in loyalty, in perseverance. But the reality, exhaustion, disrespect, burnout, clashes with that self-image. To reduce the dissonance, they don't quit. They tell themselves, this is building my resilience. I'm gaining invaluable experience. One day, they'll recognize my worth. The suffering becomes a badge of honor. The exploitation, a temporary trial. The mind has not resolved the conflict. It has reinterpreted it. Or consider the parent who sacrificed everything for their child, only to be met with resentment or distance. The belief, I gave you my life. The reality, they don't appreciate me. The dissonance is unbearable. So the parent shifts, they're going through a phase. They'll understand when they have kids of their own. I'll love them until they come back. The pain is not denied. It is sanctified. Suffering becomes proof of love. What makes cognitive dissonance so dangerous in the context of manipulation is that it turns the mind into an accomplice. The abuser doesn't need to convince you that you're wrong. They only need to create a situation where your actions and beliefs collide, and your own mind will do the rest. You become your own gaslighter. You begin to distrust your anger, dismiss your boundaries, minimize your pain, not because you're being lied to, but because you're trying to preserve a sense of self. I am not the kind of person who stays in a bad relationship. Therefore, this relationship cannot be bad. The logic is circular, but emotionally airtight. And this is where the manipulation becomes internalized. Control no longer requires external force. It is maintained by the victim's own need for consistency. The more you've invested, emotionally, financially, temporally, the greater the dissonance of leaving. The more you've sacrificed, the more you must believe it was worthwhile. This is why people stay in destructive relationships, remain in toxic jobs, defend harmful ideologies. Walking away would not just end a chapter. It would force a reckoning. I was wrong. I was used. I wasted years. And for many, that truth is more painful than the suffering itself. The implications are profound. Cognitive dissonance reveals that we are not rational actors who weigh evidence and make logical choices. We are storytellers, constantly editing our past to make sense of our present. We prefer a comforting lie to a painful truth, not because we're delusional, but because we're human. We need to believe our lives are meaningful, our choices justified, our identities intact. But this also means that freedom does not begin with external change. It begins with internal discomfort. The first step toward liberation is tolerating the dissonance, sitting with the contradiction without rushing to resolve it. Yes, I love them. And yes, they hurt me. Both are true. That space, uncomfortable, uncertain, unresolved, is where awareness grows. It is only from there that real choice becomes possible. Because once you stop lying to yourself, you can finally see clearly. Now, let us descend further, into the realm where deception doesn't just justify the past, but reshapes it, where empathy itself becomes a weapon. There is a particular kind of pressure that doesn't come from anger, but from concern. It arrives not with a shout, but with a sigh. A gentle tone. A furrowed brow. I'm only saying this because I care. 3 simple words, spoken with the softness of love, that carry the weight of absolute authority. And in that moment, resistance feels not just difficult, but cruel. How do you argue with someone who claims to have your best interests at heart? How do you reject advice wrapped in tenderness, delivered with the conviction of someone who says, "I know what's best for you"? This is weaponized empathy, the act of using care, compassion, and emotional insight not to uplift, but to dominate. It is empathy twisted into a tool of control, so seamlessly disguised as love that its victims often thank their captors for the chains. Empathy, in its purest form, is the ability to feel with another, to step into their emotional world without judgment, to witness their pain without trying to fix it. It is a bridge, not a boundary. But when empathy is weaponized, it becomes a scaffold for manipulation. The manipulator doesn't just understand your fears, your vulnerabilities, your deepest insecurities, they use them against you. They know you're afraid of failure, so they frame independence as recklessness. They know you crave approval, so they position obedience as maturity. They see your sensitivity and call it weakness. And because they speak your emotional language, because they reflect your pain back to you with such precision, their guidance feels like salvation. You don't feel controlled. You feel seen. And that is what makes the trap so inescapable. This form of manipulation thrives in relationships where power is masked as protection. Authoritarian parents use it to justify stifling their child's autonomy. You don't understand how hard the world is. I'm protecting you. A partner might say, I know you think you want to take that job, but I've seen how stressed you get. I can't watch you suffer. A friend might insist, you're too kind for that person. I'm the only one who really looks out for you. In each case, the manipulator positions themselves as the guardian of your well-being, the one who sees clearly while you are blinded by emotion, naivety, or passion. Their control is not framed as domination, but as devotion. And because it feels like love, you surrender not under threat, but under gratitude. The most insidious aspect of weaponized empathy is that it often comes from people who genuinely care. This is not a villain in a dark coat plotting your downfall. It is your mother, your lover, your mentor, someone who has, in many moments, shown real kindness. That duality is what makes it so hard to resist. The care is real. The concern is authentic. But so is the need to control. And when love and domination wear the same face, how do you separate them? Do you reject the care to escape the control? Or do you endure the control to keep the love? The choice feels impossible, because it forces you to question not just the other person, but your own worth. Am I really too fragile to make my own choices? Am I so broken that I need to be managed? Philosophically, weaponized empathy challenges one of our most cherished beliefs, that good intentions absolve harmful actions. We tell ourselves that as long as someone means well, their interference is acceptable. But care without consent is not care, it is coercion in a velvet glove. It assumes a hierarchy, the one who understands you better than you understand yourself, the one who sees your truth more clearly than you do. And in that assumption lies a quiet violence. It denies your agency. It erases your right to make mistakes, to grow through failure, to define your own path. It says, I love you too much to let you be free. This dynamic scales beyond personal relationships. Benevolent dictators throughout history have ruled with the same logic. The people are not ready for freedom. I must guide them for their own good. Therapists who overstep boundaries often justify it with, I'm doing this because I see your potential. Cult leaders don't chain their followers with iron, they chain them with concern. The outside world will destroy you. I'm the only one who truly protects you. In every case, empathy becomes the justification for erasure. The individual is not allowed to exist outside the frame the caregiver has drawn around them. And the victim, in turn, begins to internalize the narrative. They start to believe they are incapable, fragile, in need of guidance. They apologize for asserting themselves. They thank the manipulator for looking out for them, even as their autonomy diminishes. The more they are protected, the more powerless they become. And the more powerless they become, the more they seem to confirm the manipulator's belief that they need control. It is a self-fulfilling prophecy built on love. But here lies the path to liberation, the realization that true care does not seek to manage, but to empower. It does not say, let me decide for you. It says, I'll stand beside you while you decide for yourself. Real empathy respects the other's right to be wrong, to struggle, to choose a path that doesn't make sense to anyone else. It does not confuse understanding with ownership. Because love should not require the surrender of self. Now, let us turn to a different kind of power, one not exerted through action, but through stillness, through patience, through the quiet certainty that time is on their side. There is a kind of silence that does not signal absence, but presence, a stillness so deliberate it hums with intention. You've ended the relationship. You've set the boundary. You've walked away, heart pounding, determined to be free. And then, they do nothing. No pleading. No anger. No dramatic attempts to win you back. They simply wait. No messages. No calls. No appearances at your favorite places. just silence. And yet, their absence feels heavier than any argument, more persistent than any guilt trip. Because in that silence, something begins to stir, not in them, but in you. A question. A doubt. A slow, creeping loneliness. Maybe they've changed. Maybe they needed space. Maybe I was too harsh. And before you realize it, you find yourself reaching out, not because they asked, but because the quiet has pulled you back like a tide. This is strategic patience, the art of winning not by force, but by stillness. Not by chasing, but by letting the void do the work. Strategic patience is not passivity. It is not resignation. It is a calculated form of control, rooted in deep psychological insight. The manipulator understands something fundamental about human nature. We are not designed for prolonged emotional isolation. We crave connection. We fear abandonment. And when a bond, however toxic, has been severed, the resulting emptiness can be unbearable. The mind begins to romanticize the past, to soften the memory of pain, to amplify the memory of comfort. The abuser becomes the only one who truly understood you. The toxic partner becomes the one who loved you passionately. The manipulator doesn't need to prove they've changed. They only need to wait long enough for you to forget why you left. This tactic thrives on emotional entropy, the natural decay of resolve over time. In the immediate aftermath of a breakup or confrontation, clarity is sharp. The reasons for leaving are vivid, the lies, the control, the pain. But as days turn into weeks, the intensity fades. The emotions dull. The memory of comfort outweighs the memory of harm. And in that softening, vulnerability returns. The manipulator knows this. They don't fight your departure. They allow it. They may even encourage it. If that's what you need, I won't stop you. In doing so, they position themselves as the calm, reasonable one, the one who respects your freedom, who isn't desperate, who isn't clinging. And that image, that aura of emotional maturity, becomes a lure. When you finally reach out, it won't feel like surrender. It will feel like reconciliation. Like healing. Like you are the one taking the noble step. But the power dynamic has not shifted. It has been reinforced. By waiting, the manipulator has demonstrated control, not over you, but over time itself. They have shown that they can endure the silence, that they are not dependent, that they are, in fact, the center of gravity. And you, by returning, have confirmed your emotional dependence. The roles are now fixed. They are the one who can afford to wait. You are the one who cannot endure the absence. This strategy echoes ancient wisdom. Sun Tzu, in The Art of War, wrote, "Supreme excellence is breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting." The greatest victory is not won through battle, but through positioning, timing, and the mastery of stillness. The general who waits for the enemy to exhaust themselves, to make mistakes, to collapse under their own momentum, this is the true strategist. In human relationships, the same principle applies. The person who can endure the silence, who can resist the urge to react, who can let time erode the other's resolve, this is the one who holds power. They don't need to argue. They don't need to beg. They only need to exist, quietly, on the edge of your awareness, knowing that loneliness is a more persuasive force than any argument. Strategic patience appears in many forms. The ex-lover who unfollows you, then waits months before sending a single, neutral message, "Hope you're doing well." The parent who cuts off contact after a disagreement, knowing their child will eventually return, burdened by guilt. The friend who withdraws after a conflict, letting distance amplify your sense of loss. The boss who ignores your resignation, saying nothing, doing nothing, until you begin to question your decision, wonder if you overreacted, consider withdrawing your notice. In each case, the manipulator uses time as a weapon, not by acting, but by refusing to act. They become a ghost in the periphery of your life, a presence felt only through absence. And the most unsettling truth is that strategic patience often works not because the manipulator is cruel, but because they understand love, fear, and memory better than you do. They know that connection leaves a residue, that even pain can be missed, that the human heart does not heal in straight lines, but in spirals, circling back to what it once knew, even when it knows it should not. But awareness is the counterforce. To recognize strategic patience is to see the silence for what it is, not peace, but strategy. It is to honor your original clarity, to protect the reasons you walked away, to resist the seduction of nostalgia. Because sometimes, the most powerful act is not to return, but to let the silence remain. Now, let us turn to a different kind of waiting, one where stillness is not empty, but fertile, where patience is paired with the quiet cultivation of doubt. There's a moment, subtle and almost kind, when control begins not with a command, but with a question. You're preparing for a presentation, heart racing, rehearsing your words one last time. You've worked for weeks on this. You know your material. You're ready. And then, they walk in, calm, composed, and say, "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Not unkindly. Not aggressively. Just a gentle inquiry, wrapped in what sounds like concern. But the words land like a stone in still water. Ripples spread. Suddenly, your confidence wavers. Did you miss something? Are you overestimating yourself? Maybe you aren't ready. That single sentence, so innocuous, so reasonable, has done its work. It hasn't told you what to do. It hasn't criticized your work. It has simply introduced a crack in the foundation of your self-trust. This is the art of planting doubt, the quiet, deliberate erosion of certainty, the first and most essential step in the architecture of control. Doubt, in its natural form, is not destructive. It is a tool of critical thinking, a safeguard against arrogance and error. To question, to reflect, to wonder, these are signs of intelligence and humility. But when doubt is planted, not grown, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a weapon. The manipulator doesn't need to lie. They don't need to attack. They only need to whisper a question, raise an eyebrow, or offer a hesitant pause after you speak. That's an interesting approach, they might say, with just enough inflection to suggest it's anything but. You've thought through all the risks, right? Or, to a child, are you sure you can handle that responsibility? To a partner, you really think you can manage everything on your own? Each of these is a seed, small, almost invisible, dropped into the fertile soil of insecurity. And over time, with repetition, with subtle reinforcement, it grows. The power of doubt lies in its invisibility. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like care. Like caution. Like someone looking out for you. And because it arrives cloaked in reason, it bypasses our defenses. We don't resist it, we absorb it. We begin to second-guess our instincts, our memories, our abilities. We start seeking external validation, turning to the very person who planted the doubt to confirm whether we're okay. And in that act of seeking reassurance, dependence is born. The manipulator becomes the arbiter of your worth. Your confidence is no longer self-sustaining. It is conditional, granted only when they approve. This is how control begins, not with force, but with fragility. Self-trust is one of the most delicate structures in the human psyche. It is built slowly, over years of small victories, of being seen, of being believed in. But it can be shattered in moments. A single repeated phrase, "You've been so forgetful lately, you always overreact, you're not as good as you think," can unravel years of confidence. And once that trust in oneself is broken, the mind scrambles for stability. It looks outward. It begins to rely on the judgments of others. And when the only voice that seems consistent, certain, and rational is the manipulator's, submission feels like safety. But the implications of this tactic extend far beyond personal relationships. Entire systems of power rely on the strategic sowing of doubt. Authoritarian regimes flood the public with misinformation, not just to deceive, but to make truth itself feel unattainable. When citizens can no longer trust the media, the courts, or even their own memories, they become dependent on the state to tell them what is real. "You can't believe what you read," they're told. "Only we have the full picture." Cults isolate members not just physically, but epistemologically, making them doubt their own perceptions, their families, their sanity, until the leader becomes the sole source of truth. In the digital age, algorithms amplify doubt by surrounding us with contradictory information, creating a fog where nothing feels certain, and every belief requires defense. We become exhausted, and in that exhaustion, we surrender to the loudest, most confident voice, no matter how false. What makes the planting of doubt so insidious is that it turns the victim into their own oppressor. You don't need to be shouted down. You begin to silence yourself. You hesitate before speaking. You apologize before asserting. You dismiss your anger as overreaction, your insight as paranoia, your boundaries as selfishness. The manipulator doesn't have to control you, you do it for them, in the quiet moments when you ask, "Am I making a big deal out of nothing? Am I too sensitive? Am I the problem?" And once doubt takes root, it spreads. It doesn't stay confined to one area. If you can't trust your judgment in one decision, why should you trust it in others? If you were wrong about this, what else have you been wrong about? The mind, craving coherence, begins to generalize. The result is a slow erosion of agency, a life lived in quotation marks, where every choice is prefaced by hesitation, every action shadowed by second thoughts. But liberation begins with a single realization: doubt can be a tool of growth, or a tool of domination. The difference lies in who plants it, and to what end. True support doesn't make you question yourself. It helps you remember who you are. Now, let us descend further, into the territory where doubt is no longer a whisper, but a force that reshapes identity itself. There was a time when you knew who you were. You walked into a room with a quiet certainty, not because you needed to be seen, but because you felt solid within yourself. You trusted your instincts. You spoke your mind. You created, even when no one was watching. But slowly, so slowly you didn't notice it happening, those edges began to blur. The things you once loved now feel distant, like memories from someone else's life. Your opinions waver. Your passions dim. When someone asks, "What do you want?" you hesitate. You're not sure. You used to be confident, creative, curious. Now, you're not even sure what that version of you looked like. This is identity erosion, the quiet, relentless dismantling of the self, not through violence, but through 1,000 tiny cuts, each one a word, a silence, a look, a carefully timed withdrawal of approval. It is not an attack on your actions. It is an attack on your being. And when it succeeds, you don't just change, you disappear. Identity erosion is not a single event. It is a process, unfolding over months or years, often masked as concern, love, or even personal growth. It begins with small contradictions to your self-perception. You're usually so calm. What's gotten into you, they say, when you express anger? I've never known you to be this sensitive when you set a boundary. These statements don't feel like attacks. They feel like observations. But over time, they create dissonance. If the people closest to you keep telling you that you're not acting like yourself, you begin to question, am I? And if you can't trust your own reactions, your own emotions, your own memories, then what remains of identity? The process deepens with isolation. The manipulator doesn't always cut you off directly. They may simply make your friends seem unreliable, your family overbearing, your colleagues untrustworthy. They don't really get you like I do, they say. You're different around them. Slowly, the outside world fades. Fewer calls. Fewer outings. Fewer moments of reflection in the eyes of others who once knew you. Without that external mirror, your sense of self begins to wither. We are not born with identity. We grow it through relationship, through feedback, through shared experience. Remove those connections, and the self becomes unmoored. Then comes the criticism, not of your actions, but of your essence. You've always been a little scattered. You're lucky I'm patient with your moods. You wouldn't have made it this far without me. These are not corrections. They are redefinitions. They chip away at your autonomy, your competence, your worth. They frame your strengths as flaws, your independence as instability, your creativity as impracticality. Over time, you internalize the narrative. You stop initiating projects. You second-guess your ideas. You apologize before speaking. The confident person you once were doesn't vanish all at once. They are replaced by someone smaller, quieter, more compliant, a version of you that has been sculpted not by growth, but by erosion. This is the goal. Because a person who has lost their identity is no longer a challenge. They are moldable, suggestible, dependent. In cults, this process is systematic. Recruits are isolated, sleep-deprived, subjected to constant criticism and praise, until their old self dissolves and the leader's ideology can be written in its place. In abusive relationships, it happens more subtly, through gaslighting, control, and emotional starvation, until the victim no longer remembers what freedom felt like. In authoritarian environments, citizens are taught to distrust their own judgment, to fear individuality, to see conformity as survival. In each case, the outcome is the same. The self is hollowed out, leaving behind a vessel ready to be filled. The most tragic part is that identity erosion often feels like love. The manipulator may believe they are helping you become better, more grounded, less chaotic. They may frame their control as protection, their criticism as honesty, their isolation as intimacy. And because the process is so gradual, you may not realize you're losing yourself until you can't find your way back. You look in the mirror and see a stranger. You hear your voice and wonder when it became so hesitant. You try to remember what you used to believe in, what made you light up, and the memory is just out of reach. And when identity is gone, control is absolute. You no longer resist because you don't know what you're fighting for. You comply not out of fear, but out of emptiness. You become what they need you to be, because you no longer remember who you were. But healing begins with a whisper, "This isn't me." The moment you feel the absence of self, you are already on the path back. Because even a lost self leaves echoes, in old journals, in forgotten hobbies, in the quiet joy of a song that still moves you. Rebuilding is not about returning to who you were. It is about remembering that you were, and choosing, slowly, to be again. Now, let us turn to those who do not merely erase, but who actively replace, who don't just silence the self, but override it with their own design. There's a peculiar satisfaction in having an idea, especially one that feels revolutionary, deeply personal, like a sudden flash of clarity after long confusion. You sit up in bed, heart racing, convinced you've uncovered something essential. I should quit my job. I need to end this relationship. I've been living someone else's life. It feels like awakening. Like autonomy. Like truth. But what if that idea wasn't yours at all? What if it was placed, weeks ago, subtly, without your awareness, by someone who knew exactly what they were doing? This is belief implantation, the quiet, methodical process of making you believe you've arrived at a conclusion independently, when in fact, the path was laid out for you long before you began to walk it. Belief implantation doesn't rely on force or direct persuasion. It doesn't say, you should do this. It creates the conditions in which you naturally come to that conclusion. It works through suggestion, repetition, and narrative framing, tools so embedded in human communication that we rarely notice their influence. A partner might casually mention, over the course of several weeks, how unfulfilling your career seems, how stressed you've been, how much happier you were when you talked about traveling. They never suggest you quit. They only observe. They only reflect. And then, one day, you decide to leave your job, proud of your courage, unaware that the idea was nurtured in you like a seed in dark soil, watered by 1,000 offhand comments. A politician doesn't tell you to fear immigrants. They speak of protecting our way of life, of rising crime, of uncontrolled borders, phrases that prime the mind to connect unrelated concepts. The conclusion feels self-drawn. But it was guided. This technique thrives in relationships where trust exists. In therapy, ethical practitioners use suggestion to help patients reframe their thoughts. What would it feel like if you believed you were worthy? To foster growth. But in manipulation, the same tools are used to serve the manipulator's needs. A cult leader doesn't command obedience. They ask questions. Don't you feel how empty the outside world is? Can you imagine peace anywhere but here? Over time, members realize they belong, not because they were told, but because they believe they've discovered it themselves. In advertising, we are never told, buy this and you'll be loved. Instead, we see images of connection, joy, beauty linked, without words, to a product. The desire feels internal. The decision feels free. But the association was planted. The power of belief implantation lies in its invisibility. When you think you've chosen, you don't resist. You don't question. You act with conviction, believing you are exercising free will. But if your thoughts are not your own, then autonomy becomes a performance. You are not the author of your decisions. You are the stage on which someone else's script is played out. This is not paranoia. It is psychology. Studies in cognitive science show that humans are highly susceptible to priming, subtle cues that influence behavior without conscious awareness. Show someone words related to aging, and they'll walk slower down a hallway. Mention independence, and people make more self-focused choices. These effects happen beneath the level of thought. And if a simple word can alter behavior, imagine what a sustained campaign of suggestion can do to belief. The implications are deeply unsettling. If your ideas can be seeded without your knowledge, then the self, the I that thinks, decides, believes, may be far more porous than we assume. We like to believe in the sovereignty of the mind, in the sanctity of personal insight. But what if the mind is not a fortress, but a landscape open to quiet cultivation? What if the most intimate parts of your identity, your values, your desires, your sense of purpose, are not discoveries, but implants? Philip K. Dick once wrote, "The most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history." Belief implantation is a form of historical erasure, not of facts, but of origin. It doesn't just change what you think. It changes how you think you came to think it. You lose not only the truth, but the memory of how you lost it. And in that gap, the manipulator remains invisible. They are never seen as the source. They are merely the one who understood you, who supported your journey, who knew you'd figure it out. This is how entire ideologies take root. A person begins to believe they've independently concluded that a certain group is dangerous, that a particular lifestyle is immoral, that a leader is the only solution, never realizing their mind was shaped by years of selective exposure, loaded language, and emotional framing. The belief feels like revelation. It feels like truth. But it was engineered. Yet awareness is the first light in the dark. To question not just what you believe, but how you came to believe it, is an act of resistance. Did this idea emerge from within, or was it introduced, nurtured, repeated until it felt inevitable? The mind can be infiltrated, but it can also awaken. Now, let us turn to the final stage of control, one where even the desire for freedom is turned against you, where liberation itself becomes the bait in a deeper trap. There comes a moment in nearly every oppressive relationship, personal, professional, ideological, when the possibility of leaving flickers into view. You feel it in a quiet breath, a pause in the storm, a sudden clarity. I could walk away. The thought is electric, almost sacred. It carries the weight of potential, of rebirth, of a life unshackled. But then, almost immediately, the counterforce arrives, not as a shout, not as a threat, but as a whisper wrapped in care. I just don't know how you'll survive out there. You're not ready. No one else will understand you like I do. You'll destroy yourself without me. These are not commands. They are warnings, delivered with such tenderness that resistance feels not just difficult, but reckless. This is the freedom trap, the art of making liberation feel like self-destruction. Freedom traps do not rely on chains. They rely on fear, the deep, primal fear of the unknown. Human beings are not naturally drawn to uncertainty. We evolved to seek safety, predictability, belonging. And when a manipulator frames independence as chaos, they tap into that ancient survival instinct. They don't say, "You can't leave." They say, "You shouldn't." They don't lock the door. They stand beside it, shaking their head, and say, "It's cold out there. The world is cruel. You'll be alone. You'll fail." And because these warnings often contain grains of truth, because life is uncertain, because change is hard, because love is rare, the mind hesitates. The manipulator becomes the voice of reason, while the desire for freedom is cast as impulsiveness, as rebellion, as self-sabotage. This is how control endures long after abuse is recognized. You may know, intellectually, that the relationship is toxic. You may have documented the lies, the manipulation, the erosion of self. But the idea of stepping into the void, of facing life without the structure, however warped, that has defined your days, feels unbearable. The manipulator has reframed freedom not as relief, but as risk. Not as healing, but as collapse. And so, you stay, not because you want to, but because the alternative feels like falling into an abyss. The freedom trap is especially effective because it mirrors genuine concern. The manipulator may truly believe you're fragile. They may have convinced themselves that their control is protection. A parent might say, "You can't live on your own, you've never balanced the budget," not to dominate, but out of fear that their child will suffer. A partner might insist, "You'll never find someone who loves you this much," not out of malice, but from a twisted sense of devotion. But the effect is the same. Autonomy is framed as danger. And the victim, already weakened by years of doubt and identity erosion, begins to believe it. They internalize the narrative. They start to see independence not as a right, but as a gamble with their survival. Philosophically, this reflects the core tension of existential freedom. As thinkers like Soren Kierkegaard and Jean-Paul Sartre observed, freedom is not just liberating, it is terrifying. To be free is to be responsible. To choose is to bear the weight of consequence. There is no one to blame but yourself. In a toxic relationship, staying means predictability, even if it's painful. Leaving means uncertainty, even if it leads to peace. And for many, the known hell is preferable to the unknown heaven. The manipulator knows this. They don't need to threaten violence. They only need to amplify the anxiety of choice. They become the guardian of your fear, offering the illusion of safety in exchange for your surrender. This dynamic plays out on both intimate and societal levels. Cults don't just isolate members, they convince them that the outside world is spiritually corrupt, physically dangerous, existentially meaningless. Abusive partners don't just monitor their victims, they convince them that no one else will ever love them, that they're too broken, too damaged, too much and not enough all at once. Authoritarian regimes tell citizens, without us, there will be chaos, framing oppression as order, control as care. Even in workplaces, employees are subtly conditioned to believe that leaving means career suicide, that no other company will value them, that stability is worth any cost. In each case, freedom is not forbidden. It is pathologized. It is made to feel like a threat to the self. And the cruelest irony is that the more someone longs for freedom, the more they may fear it. The desire to escape becomes entangled with guilt, with self-doubt, with the haunting question, if I'm so unhappy, why can't I leave? That question breeds shame. It makes the victim feel weak, complicit, broken. The trap tightens not through external force, but through internalized belief. I can't leave because I'm not strong enough. Because I'll fail. Because I deserve this. But liberation begins with a single realization: fear of freedom does not mean freedom is wrong. It means it is real. And real freedom always demands courage, not because it guarantees safety, but because it demands authenticity. To walk away is not to guarantee happiness. It is to reclaim the right to choose your own suffering, your own joy, your own path. Now, let us turn to a different kind of bond, one not built on fear, but on debt, where love is not given, but earned through endless repayment. There is a particular weight to the words "I gave you everything," spoken not in pride, but in sorrow. They hang in the air like a verdict, heavy with implication. You didn't ask for an inventory of sacrifices. You didn't sign a contract. And yet, in that moment, you feel it, the sudden pressure of a debt you never agreed to, one that cannot be repaid in money, time, or effort, only in obedience. This is manufactured obligation, the quiet, insidious creation of a moral or emotional debt where none was freely incurred. It is not gratitude. It is guilt dressed as duty. It is love transformed into ledger, every act of care recorded not as a gift, but as a loan accruing interest in silence. Manufactured obligation thrives in relationships where power is disguised as generosity. A parent says, "I worked 2 jobs so you could have a better life," not to share their struggle, but to make your independence feel like betrayal. A partner reminds you, "I stayed with you through your darkest days," not as a testament to loyalty, but as leverage when you dare to set a boundary. A boss implies, "After all I've done for your career, this is how you repay me," when you request time off or negotiate a raise. In each case, an act of care, real or exaggerated, is reframed as a transaction. The giver becomes a creditor. the receiver, a debtor. And the currency is not money, but compliance, your time, your silence, your surrender of self. What makes this manipulation so effective is that it exploits one of the deepest moral instincts we possess, the need to be grateful. From childhood, we are taught that kindness must be honored, that sacrifice deserves recognition, that love should be returned in kind. Gratitude is a cornerstone of healthy relationships. But when gratitude is weaponized, when it is used not to deepen connection, but to enforce submission, it becomes a tool of control. The manipulator doesn't demand. They remind. They don't command. They mourn. After everything I've done is not a statement. It is a sentence. And the only way to serve it is to give up your autonomy, your choices, your right to live a life that doesn't revolve around their needs. The debt is rarely defined. It cannot be itemized or settled. It grows with every passing year, every unmet expectation, every moment you fail to perform the role they've assigned you. You owe them for your education, for your childhood, for their patience, for their love, even if that love was conditional, even if it came with strings. The more you try to repay it, the deeper you sink, because the goal is not balance. The goal is dependence. A debtor cannot be free. A debtor must always return to the source of the loan, hat in hand, seeking forgiveness, seeking permission, seeking the illusion of closure that never comes. This dynamic is especially potent in families, where the bonds of blood are assumed to erase the boundaries of self. Children are made to feel they owe their existence, their upbringing, their very being to their parents. In some cultures, this is framed as filial duty. In manipulation, it becomes a prison. You owe me respect. You owe me loyalty. You owe me your presence at every holiday. The word owe turns love into law. And because the debt is infinite, the obligation is eternal. You can never do enough. You can never be far enough away. Even silence is interpreted as ingratitude. Even self-care is seen as rejection. But the deeper implication of manufactured obligation is that it perverts the very nature of love. True care is not a transaction. It does not keep score. It gives not to receive, but because giving is an expression of connection. When we love someone, we do not hand them a receipt. We do not say, "Remember this when you grow up." We act because we see their need and respond to it, not because we expect repayment, but because love, at its core, is a gift. And a gift, by definition, carries no obligation. To demand return is to reveal that the gift was never freely given. Yet in the world of manufactured obligation, love is never free. It is always conditional. It is given with invisible contracts, with silent expectations, with emotional IOUs written in the margins of every kind act. And because the giver often believes in their own sacrifice, the manipulation is rarely conscious. They may genuinely feel unappreciated. They may carry real pain. But that pain does not justify turning love into a debt. The ethics of gratitude must be questioned. Should we ever owe someone for loving us? Should a child owe a parent for raising them? Should a partner owe another for staying through hard times? If the answer is yes, then love becomes a currency, and relationships become economies of emotional exchange. And in that economy, freedom is bankruptcy. The psychological toll is profound. The victim lives in a constant state of indebtedness, unable to make choices without asking, would this hurt them? Would this seem ungrateful? Am I betraying them? Their life becomes a performance of repayment, not a pursuit of self. They suppress desires, abandon dreams, endure mistreatment, not because they agree with it, but because they believe they have no right to want more. The manipulator doesn't need to punish. The guilt does it for them. And the most tragic part is that the manipulator often believes they are being selfless. They see themselves as the giver, the martyr, the one who has sacrificed everything. They do not see the chains they've forged. They do not see how their love has become a burden. And because they believe in their own righteousness, they cannot hear the quiet plea beneath the compliance, "Let me be free. Let me love you without owing you." But liberation begins with a radical redefinition. Love should not be repaid. It should be honored, not through obedience, but through authenticity. Not through sacrifice, but through presence. And sometimes, the most loving act is to say, "I appreciate what you've done, but I do not owe you my life." Now, let us turn to a different kind of control, one not built on debt, but on silence, on the unspoken threat of conflict, on the quiet terror of breaking the peace. There is a kind of silence that doesn't come from calm, but from fear. You're in the kitchen, the air thick with unspoken tension. You want to say something, something small, something true. "I felt hurt when you didn't call. I need more help around the house. I don't agree with what you said." But the words catch in your throat. Not because they aren't valid. Not because they're unfair. But because you know what comes next. The sudden shift in their voice. The cold stare. The tears that fall like punishment. The door slammed so hard the walls tremble. Or worse, the silence that follows, deeper and heavier than any shout, the kind that makes the house feel like a tomb. So you swallow the words. You nod. You smile. You change the subject. You keep the peace. And in that quiet surrender, control is maintained, not through force, but through the unbearable weight of potential conflict. This is the fear of conflict, not a personal flaw, but a cultivated vulnerability, one that manipulators exploit with quiet precision. The manipulator doesn't always need to threaten. They don't need to issue ultimatums or scream. They only need to have made conflict so dangerous in the past that the mere possibility of it paralyzes you. A partner who collapses into sobs when challenged. A parent who says, "After all I've done, this is how you speak to me?" A friend who disappears for days after a disagreement, returning only when you apologize, regardless of who was wrong. These are not isolated reactions. They are patterns. And over time, they teach you that honesty is not bravery, it is recklessness. That truth is not liberation, it is destruction. That speaking up doesn't resolve tension, it unleashes chaos. And so, you learn to stay small. To edit yourself. To prioritize harmony over authenticity. You don't stay quiet because you agree. You stay quiet because you want to survive the aftermath. This form of control is especially insidious because it wears the face of peace. You're not being oppressed by tyranny. You're being protected from turmoil. The manipulator may even frame themselves as the one suffering. You're the one causing drama. You're the one who can't handle emotions. You're the one who ruins everything. In this reversal, the victim becomes the aggressor, and the manipulator, the victim of your harshness. The message is clear: if you want calm, you must conform. If you want love, you must silence yourself. And because human beings are wired for connection, for belonging, for safety, the choice feels obvious. You choose peace. You choose quiet. You choose compliance. But peace without truth is not peace. It is suppression. It is a ceasefire in a war you are not allowed to acknowledge. The implications of this dynamic extend far beyond personal relationships. Entire societies are governed by the same mechanism. Dissent is not always crushed with violence. Often, it is discouraged through cost. Speak up at work, and you're labeled difficult. Protest injustice, and you're called divisive. Challenge authority, and you're ostracized, ignored, gaslit. The message is never spoken outright: be quiet, or you will pay. But it is felt in every sideways glance, every withdrawn invitation, every promotion given to someone more agreeable. In families, the black sheep is the one who asked questions. In politics, the radical is the one who refuses to compromise their principles. In every case, the price of conflict is isolation, rejection, loss. And so, most people choose silence. They choose the illusion of harmony. They choose the prison of peace. What makes this control so effective is that it doesn't feel like control. It feels like maturity. Like patience. Like love. You tell yourself you're being understanding, flexible, kind. But kindness should not require self-erasure. Patience should not mean enduring harm. And love should never be conditional on silence. When harmony becomes more important than honesty, relationships cease to be partnerships and become performances, carefully choreographed to avoid the detonation of emotion. You stop sharing your true thoughts. You stop setting boundaries. You stop growing. Because growth requires friction. It requires disagreement. It requires the courage to say, this isn't okay. But in an environment where conflict is equated with destruction, there is no room for growth, only stillness. And the tragedy is that the manipulator often doesn't see themselves as a tyrant. They may believe they are sensitive, deeply feeling, emotionally honest. They may not realize that their reactions, however genuine, are being used as weapons. But intention does not erase impact. A person who collapses into tears every time they're questioned may feel victimized, but they are still enforcing silence. A leader who punishes dissent with coldness may believe they're maintaining order, but they are still crushing truth. Liberation begins not with a shout, but with a whisper, I will speak, even if it shakes. It begins in the decision to tolerate discomfort, not just in others, but in oneself. To understand that conflict is not the opposite of love. It is often its deepest expression. That a relationship strong enough to survive disagreement is stronger than one built on fragile silence. Because peace should not be the absence of conflict. It should be the presence of resolution. Now, let us turn to a different kind of influence, one not wielded through emotion, but through consensus, where control is hidden in the illusion of belonging. There's a quiet moment, almost imperceptible, when the weight of a single phrase tilts your judgment, everyone else is on board. You're in a meeting, hesitant about a decision, when someone leans forward and says, honestly, I think we're all in agreement. You glance around. No one speaks up. Nods ripple through the room. And suddenly, your doubt feels like isolation. You weren't sure before, but now, you begin to wonder, am I the only one who sees a problem? Am I overthinking? Maybe I'm the one who doesn't get it. You stay silent. You go along. Not because you're convinced. Not because the logic is sound. But because the illusion of consensus is stronger than your own intuition. This is social proof, the psychological phenomenon where we look to others to determine what is true, acceptable, or safe. And when weaponized, it becomes one of the most invisible, pervasive forms of manipulation, not through force, not through argument, but through the silent pressure of belonging. Social proof is not inherently malicious. In fact, it's a survival mechanism refined over millennia. Early humans who followed the group, fleeing when others ran, eating what others ate, trusting the behaviors of the tribe, were more likely to survive. To doubt the collective was to risk exile, danger, death. That instinct is still wired into our brains. When we're uncertain, we don't turn inward. We turn outward. We scan the faces around us, searching for cues. If everyone else is calm, we assume there's no threat. If everyone is excited, we assume there's value. If no one objects, we assume there's nothing to object to. This is why laugh tracks make sitcoms seem funnier, why crowded restaurants feel more appealing, why viral trends spread like wildfire. We don't just imitate, we trust the crowd. And that trust, while often useful, is also deeply exploitable. Manipulators know this. They don't always need to persuade you directly. They only need to make you believe that everyone else is already persuaded. A cult leader doesn't argue theology. They say, all of us have seen the light. You're the only one holding back. A politician doesn't defend their policy with data. They say, real Americans support this. A toxic partner doesn't justify their jealousy. They say, any loving person would want to know where you are. In each case, the message is the same: conformity is virtue. Dissent is deviation. And if you resist, you're not just disagreeing, you're separating yourself from the tribe. The fear of being the outlier, the skeptic, the difficult one, becomes stronger than the need for truth. This tactic thrives in ambiguity. When a situation is unclear, when emotions run high, when logic is clouded, social proof fills the void. It provides a shortcut through uncertainty. And because it feels like wisdom, like collective intelligence, it rarely triggers suspicion. You don't feel manipulated. You feel aligned. But alignment without awareness is not connection. It is compliance. And the more we outsource our judgment to the group, the more fragile our autonomy becomes. The implications are profound. Social proof doesn't just influence decisions, it shapes identity. We don't just do what others do. We begin to believe what others believe, even when it contradicts our own experience. History is littered with examples: the bystander effect, where witnesses failed to help a victim because no one else does; the Ash conformity experiments, where individuals denied obvious visual evidence because the group claimed otherwise; the rise of extremist ideologies, where ordinary people commit atrocities because everyone around them approved. In each case, the individual mind did not break. It surrendered to the illusion of consensus. And in the digital age, social proof has been weaponized at scale. Algorithms amplify popularity, making viral content seem more credible, more true, simply because it's widely shared. Online reviews are faked. Engagement is bought. Influencers are paid to pretend enthusiasm. The message is constant: this is what people want. This is what people believe. You should too. We scroll through feeds where dissent is drowned out by the roar of apparent agreement, and we begin to doubt our own perceptions. If thousands are praising a product, a leader, a lifestyle, mustn't it be good? The manipulator doesn't need to lie. They only need to manufacture the appearance of mass approval. But the most unsettling truth is that social proof makes us complicit in our own manipulation. We don't just follow the crowd, we become part of it, reinforcing the illusion for others. You like a post not because you care, but because many others have. You stay silent in a meeting not because you agree, but because no one else speaks up. You defend a decision not because it's right, but because everyone supports it. In doing so, you add your weight to the momentum, making it harder for anyone else to question it. The system sustains itself not through command, but through silent participation. And in that silence, individuality erodes. We forget that progress has never come from consensus. It has come from the one person who said no. The one who doubted. The one who stood apart. But the cost of standing apart is high: rejection, ridicule, isolation. And so, most of us choose the safety of the crowd. Yet freedom begins in the willingness to be wrong. To say, I see it differently. To tolerate the discomfort of disagreement. To trust your own eyes, even when no one else does. Because truth does not require a majority. Now, let us turn to the final and most haunting of all mind games, one where the manipulator has already won, not by controlling you, but by making you believe the game was yours to play all along. There comes a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when the manipulator no longer needs to speak. You've internalized their voice. It lives now in the silence between your thoughts, in the hesitation before you speak, in the way you catch yourself mid-sentence and think, no, that's not what they'd want to hear. You don't wait for their disapproval. You anticipate it. You don't need them to correct you. You do it yourself. You police your own emotions, dismiss your own needs, silence your own desires, not because they've commanded it, but because the rules have become automatic, woven into the fabric of your mind. This is the phenomenon of self-replicating beliefs, the point at which external control dissolves into internal obedience. The puppeteer has vanished, but the strings remain, now tied to your own hands. Self-replicating beliefs are not implanted in a single act. They are cultivated over time, through repetition, emotional conditioning, and the slow erosion of self-trust. A parent says, "You're too sensitive," every time you express pain, until you stop naming your hurt. A partner says, "You always overreact," every time you set a boundary, until you apologize before you even speak. A boss implies that your ideas are interesting, but not quite practical, until you stop offering them altogether. At first, the criticism comes from outside. But after years of hearing it, the voice migrates. It no longer needs to be spoken. It echoes in your mind, ready to intervene before you even act. You don't need to be controlled. You control yourself. This is the most refined form of manipulation, not domination, but assimilation. The manipulator doesn't just change your behavior. They change your inner world. Their beliefs become your instincts. Their standards become your self-worth. Their fears become your limits. And because the process is gradual, you don't feel invaded. You feel aligned. You believe you are thinking for yourself, when in fact, you are replaying a script written long ago. You call it self-discipline. You call it maturity. You call it growth. But sometimes, it is none of those things. Sometimes, it is obedience disguised as thought. The tragedy of self-replicating beliefs is that they make freedom invisible. When the jailer is inside, there is no door to open, no wall to climb. The cage is made of assumptions so deep they feel like truth. I can't speak up, I'll cause conflict. I shouldn't ask for more, I don't deserve it. If I leave, I'll fail. These are not conclusions drawn from evidence. They are beliefs so thoroughly internalized that they no longer feel like beliefs at all. They feel like reality. And because they feel like reality, you don't question them. You live within them, as naturally as a fish lives in water. This is the ultimate victory for the manipulator, not that you obey them, but that you obey in their absence. They no longer need to punish you for stepping out of line. You do it for them. You feel shame without being shamed. You withdraw without being rejected. You abandon your dreams without being told they're impossible. The control has become autonomous, self-sustaining, invisible. And because you are the one enforcing it, you cannot name it as oppression. To do so would be to accuse yourself. And who would believe you if you said, "I am trapped by my own mind"? The implications are profound. When beliefs replicate themselves, the individual ceases to be a source of original thought. they become a vessel for inherited fear. Entire lives are lived according to rules that were never questioned, never chosen, never even noticed. People stay in unfulfilling relationships, unlivable jobs, unsustainable patterns, not because they are forced, but because their minds have been trained to reject alternatives. The possibility of change feels not just difficult, but dangerous. To think differently would mean dismantling the self. And that is the deepest fear of all, not pain, not loss, but the collapse of identity. Yet this internalized control is not a life sentence. Liberation begins in a single, trembling realization: this thought is not mine. The moment you hear the voice in your head and recognize it as foreign, that's the crack in the prison wall. It may have spoken in your voice for years, but it does not belong to you. It was borrowed, imposed, repeated until it felt true. And once you see it for what it is, you can begin to question it. You can pause. You can say, do I believe this? Or was I taught to believe it? You can test it. Step slightly outside the boundary. Speak the forbidden thought. Feel the fear, and act anyway. Because freedom is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to move through it. And when the mind begins to reclaim its sovereignty, the jailer fades. Not with a battle. Not with a shout. But with a whisper: I don't have to think this way. Now, let us turn to the final question, the one that lingers in the silence after all the games are named. After 26 mind games, each one peeling back a layer of influence, each revelation pulling you deeper into the hidden architecture of control, there comes a silence. Not the silence of avoidance, but the kind that follows a long journey through shadowed rooms. You've seen the gaslighting, the guilt trips, the silent treatments, the manufactured obligations. You've recognized the ways others have shaped your thoughts, your emotions, your very sense of self. But now, in the stillness, one question rises, not from the outside, but from within. Are you the one playing the game, or are you the one being played? And beneath that, an even more unsettling whisper: or have you been both all along? This is the mirror paradox, the moment you realize that the manipulator is not always a figure across the table. Sometimes, they live in a reflection. We speak of manipulation as something done to us. We name the abusers, the narcissists, the coercive partners, the manipulative leaders. We draw lines between victim and perpetrator, innocence and guilt. But the truth is far more complex. We are not passive recipients of psychological games. We are also their players, sometimes knowingly, often not. We use guilt to keep a loved one close. We withhold affection to gain compliance. We frame stories to cast ourselves as the hero. We mirror, we love bomb, we deploy silence, not always with malice, but with need. To be heard. To be loved. To survive. The line between self-protection and manipulation is not a wall. It is a fog, shifting with context, with emotion, with the quiet desperation to belong. This is the heart of the paradox. The closer we look at the mind games of others, the more we see our own fingerprints on them. The parent who uses guilt to keep their child home for the holidays believes they're expressing love. The partner who withholds words to punish a perceived slight may not even recognize their silence as a weapon. The friend who amplifies drama to stay central in a group doesn't see themselves as a manipulator. They feel seen, finally, after years of invisibility. And in that blindness, the game continues. Not because people are inherently cruel, but because we are all shaped by wounds, by fear, by the unmet need to matter. But here lies the danger, believing in our own innocence. The greatest mind game is not the one played by others, but the one we play on ourselves, the story that says, I would never do that. I'm not like them. That belief shields us from self-awareness. It allows us to point outward while remaining blind to the ways we, too, bend reality, shape narratives, and seek control. And in that blindness, we remain trapped in a cycle. We react to manipulation with more manipulation. We fight coercion with subtle domination. We break free from one puppeteer only to pull strings of our own. Yet awareness changes everything. To see these games, not just in others, but in ourselves, is not to condemn. It is to awaken. It is to recognize that manipulation is not the mark of a monster, but a symptom of a deeper human condition, our fear of abandonment, our hunger for security, our longing to be understood. And when we see that, we can begin to respond differently, not with judgment, but with compassion. Not with retaliation, but with boundaries. Not with denial, but with responsibility. Because understanding these 27 mind games was never just about defense. It was about reflection. It was about asking not only who has shaped me, but how have I shaped others? And in that question, there is the possibility of change. Not perfection. Not purity. But presence. The ability to pause before you speak, to feel the impulse to control, and to choose another path. To love without leverage. To connect without coercion. To be honest, even when it's easier to manipulate. And in that awareness, you reclaim something essential, agency. Not the illusion of total freedom, no one is untouched by influence, but the quiet power to see, to choose, to shift. You are not powerless. You are not passive. You are awake. And sometimes, that is enough. Now, let the weight of these thoughts settle. Let them drift like dust motes in moonlight, soft and slow. You don't need to solve everything tonight. You don't need to fix anyone. You only need to breathe. In and out. Here. Present. No longer a pawn, no longer a puppeteer, but a witness to the intricate dance of human connection. Thank you for listening. Let these reflections accompany you into stillness. Sleep well,